Section 1. The network that could not stop sabotaging itself. There is something almost poetic about the fact that one of the most successful animated shows in television history spent its first few years being treated like an unwanted houseguest. It was shuffled from room to room, given no permanent place to settle, shown the door not once but twice, before the people who had thrown it out discovered that the rest of the country had been quietly falling in love with it the whole time. Family Guy arrived on the 31st of January 1999. That was a Sunday night, right after Fox broadcast Super Bowl 23, which is about the most desirable television real estate you can imagine. Millions of people were still settled into their couches, the game winding down, snacks half-eaten, not quite ready to move on with their evening, and suddenly here was this strange, fast-talking, joke-dense animated show about a dysfunctional Rhode Island family. The first episode, titled Death Has a Shadow, pulled in around 22 million viewers. Seth MacFarlane had spent 6 months with essentially no sleep and no social life, drawing in his kitchen and recording voices into what amounted to a glorified demo tape, and the result was a number that would make any network executive reach for the phone. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the very beginning of MacFarlane's journey toward that moment. He had graduated from Rhode Island School of Design in the mid-1990s and gone to work at Hanna-Barbera, one of the legendary studios that had given American culture, the Flintstones and Scooby-Doo, and a whole generation of animated characters that embedded themselves permanently in the national imagination. While working there, still in his early 20s, he made 2 short animated films on his own time, things he created because he had ideas that needed somewhere to go. He called them The Life of Larry and Steve. They were simple, a chunky, ordinary guy named Larry and his talking dog Steve, nothing especially polished or ambitious in terms of production value. But they captured the attention of the right people at exactly the right moment. An executive introduced MacFarlane to Mike Darnell, who ran alternative programming at Fox. Darnell later said that when MacFarlane pitched him the concept for a show, voices and all, performing each character live in the room, he thought the young man was either crazy or a genius. It turned out he was a genius. Fox gave MacFarlane somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000 to produce a short pilot pitch. This is an almost insultingly small budget for animated production, given that a standard primetime animated episode cost at least $1 million to produce at the time. MacFarlane spent those 6 months doing most of it himself, sketching characters, refining the concept, recording voice performances to demonstrate what the show could be. He created a 15-minute demonstration of the world he wanted to build. That demo featured the Griffin family in recognizable form, Peter and Lois and the kids, with Brian the talking dog positioned as the grounded voice in the middle of the chaos. Fox looked at it, liked what they saw, and ordered the full series. The first season ran from January through May of 1999 in the 8:30 on Sunday night slot, sandwiched between The Simpsons and The X-Files. That was a genuinely comfortable home. 2 established audiences bookending a new show, giving it a warm population of viewers who were already settled in for the evening and had no particular reason to change the channel. The show averaged 12.8 million households and finished the season ranked 33rd in the overall Nielsen ratings. For a brand new animated show with an untested creator, those were solid numbers. The kind that should have told the network that an audience had found this show and liked what it found, and that the sensible move was to protect that audience relationship by keeping the show somewhere people could keep finding it. Fox did not do that. Season 2 launched in September of 1999 in a new Thursday night time slot at 9 in the evening. If you were watching American television in the fall of 1999, you knew exactly what was on NBC at 9 on Thursday nights. It was Frasier, the beloved comedy about an uptight Seattle psychiatrist that had become one of the most acclaimed and widely watched programs on American television. Frasier was part of NBC's must-see TV block, a programming institution that had dominated Thursday night viewing throughout the 1990s, with Seinfeld, ER, and Friends forming what felt like an impenetrable wall of ratings dominance. Scheduling a relatively new, still finding its footing animated show directly against one of the most celebrated comedies on television was not a strategy. It was the equivalent of entering a local youth soccer team in a World Cup qualifier and then acting surprised when the results came in. The ratings dropped sharply and almost immediately. Fox pulled the show from the schedule, aired episodes at irregular intervals without advance notice to the audience, then moved it to Tuesday nights where it faced Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. In the winter of 2000, that program was not simply a successful show, it was a genuine national phenomenon. Regis Philbin was asking ordinary Americans questions for potentially life-changing sums of money, and the show was airing multiple nights per week with an audience that had become almost habitual in its loyalty. Against it, Family Guy had essentially no path to maintaining anything like its first season audience. By the end of that second season, Fox had canceled the show. Then, in one of those reversals that only happens in the more chaotic corners of the entertainment business, they changed their mind almost immediately. By July of 2000, just weeks after canceling it, Fox had ordered 13 more episodes for a third season. The show came back in late 2001 on Thursdays at 8 in the evening, where it faced both Friends and Survivor airing simultaneously on competing networks. Friends was the most watched show on American television and had been for years. Survivor had invented the American reality television era with its first season in the summer of 2000 and was deep into its popular run by 2001. Between these two programs, the available Thursday night viewership was largely claimed by audiences who had already decided where they were spending their Thursday evenings. The ratings kept falling. Fox kept shuffling the show through different time slots during the season, hoping some configuration would catch on and stabilize the numbers. None of them did. In May of 2002, the network announced that Family Guy was canceled, again, this time with apparent finality. The last episode of the third season left one story completely unaired, a completed episode sitting in a vault going nowhere. The show that had launched to 22 million viewers on Super Bowl Sunday was finished. Here is what makes this whole saga genuinely fascinating as a piece of television history. The cancellation in 2002 was driven almost entirely by a scheduling war. The show had no ability to win. The quality of those first 3 seasons was, by most assessments, genuinely strong. Critics had responded positively. The Emmy voters would eventually, in 2009, nominate Family Guy for Outstanding Comedy Series, the first animated show to receive that particular distinction since The Flintstones in 1961. The seeds of that recognition existed in those early seasons. The problem was never the show. The problem was a network that kept placing it against the strongest competition in television history and drawing from the results the conclusion that the show had failed, rather than that the scheduling had failed. After the cancellation, Fox tried to sell the rerun rights to the show and found almost nobody interested. The prevailing wisdom in the industry was that a show that had been canceled twice was a failed product with no residual value. Cartoon Network came in with an offer for essentially nothing and turned it into one of the most significant business transactions in cable television history. Family Guy reruns premiered on Adult Swim on the 20th of April 2003, and the numbers that came back were stunning. Almost immediately, Family Guy became the highest-rated program in the entire Adult Swim block. The audience that Fox had failed to consistently reach during prime time was right there, waiting, in the late-night cable hours when nobody had been looking for them. Viewership on the Adult Swim block increased by 239%. That is not a small improvement. That is a transformation of the entire operation. Simultaneously, Fox released DVD sets of the first 2 seasons, and those sold at a pace nobody had anticipated. Nearly 400,000 copies moved in the first month. By the end of 2003, combined DVD sales had made Family Guy the best-selling television DVD release of the entire year, beating out critically acclaimed shows with much larger ongoing public profiles. People were actively seeking out a canceled animated show, buying physical discs, watching them at home, and telling their friends about them. A cult following had formed without anyone at Fox doing anything deliberate to cultivate it. Fox, seeing these numbers, came back around in the way that networks always eventually come around when money is clearly being left on the table. On the 26th of March 2004, it was official. Family Guy was returning. Not a tentative pickup, but a commitment of 35 new episodes before a single frame of new animation had been produced. The Season 4 premiere aired on the 1st of May 2005 and drew 11.85 million viewers, the most watched episode since the very first season. The audience had been waiting with considerable patience, and they showed up to prove it. This is where the first major scandal of the Family Guy story lives, though it is a scandal of a quiet and institutional kind rather than a dramatic and public one. A network that could not decide whether it believed in what it had, that moved a show against impossible competition, and concluded the show had failed rather than that the scheduling had failed, that sold away rerun rights for essentially nothing, and then had to bid back into its own asset at a significantly higher cost. The institutional indifference of Fox's early treatment of Family Guy nearly destroyed something that turned out to be genuinely valuable, and the show's creative trajectory was shaped permanently by those disruptions, including the scattering of the original writing team during the years of cancellation. MacFarlane noted in interviews that one consequence of the show's constant disruptions was that they were always having to bring in new writers. Some of the most formative voices from the original 3 seasons had moved on by the time the show came back in 2005. Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman had left to co-create American Dad. Others had found their way to Scrubs and other projects that needed writers. The writing room that reassembled for Season 4 was talented and committed, but it was not the same configuration that had built the show's original voice. These are the kinds of invisible costs that scheduling disasters leave behind. The ones that never make headlines, but that show up in the texture of what gets made afterward. Drop a comment below and let us know where you are watching from right now and what time it is where you are. These videos reach people all over the world at all kinds of hours, and it is always genuinely lovely to see where. And if you are finding this kind of content helpful for winding down, at the end of the day, subscribing takes just a few seconds and it genuinely makes a real difference to this channel. Section 2. The Resurrection and What 3 Years Away Actually Cost. When Family Guy came back in 2005, the story being told about it was almost entirely triumphant. A show that had been canceled twice, dismissed by the industry as a failed experiment, sold off for essentially nothing to a cable network that needed late-night content, and then risen again on the strength of late-night cable ratings and physical media sales during a transitional moment in how Americans consumed entertainment. The narrative practically wrote itself with minimal editorial assistance, and the entertainment press was happy to tell it. What did not get as much attention in those early celebration pieces was a deeper and more complicated question. What had those 3 years off the air actually done to the show itself, to the particular combination of instincts and sensibilities and relationships between writers that had made those first 3 seasons work the way they did? The answer, visible in retrospect with considerably more clarity than it was visible at the time, was that the gap had cost more than anyone was initially willing to acknowledge. The animation shift deserves attention because the visual quality of an animated show is not a superficial concern. It is embedded in the comedy in ways that affect how jokes land, how characters express themselves, and how the entire fictional world feels to someone watching it from outside. The original seasons, particularly the 2nd and 3rd seasons produced by Rough Draft Studios, had a particular physical quality to them. The characters moved with a kind of loose, slightly scrappy expressiveness that felt alive in a specific way. The drawings had weight. When Peter fell downstairs or got hit in the face or ran into something, the animation conveyed actual physical consequence because the motion had genuine character to it. The show looked like it was made by people who were excited about making it. When the show returned for Season 4, different studios were handling the production work. The visual approach became noticeably cleaner and more controlled. Lines were thicker and more consistent. Movements were more restricted and carefully managed. Character expressions, while technically correct, had lost some of the spontaneous energy that had made the earlier work feel alive rather than produced. The show was more polished in a way that actually cost it something, that quality of looking handmade and urgent that the original seasons had possessed. None of this would have been a scandal on its own. Because animation styles change and production pipelines evolve and different studios bring different strengths. But the animation shift was a symptom of something broader happening to the show, and the broader thing was more significant. The writing room was different. Some of the most formative voices from the original run were gone. MacFarlane was now managing 2 simultaneous animated series and developing ambitions that went well beyond animated television. The cutaway gag balance had already begun to shift in ways that would become much more pronounced as the seasons accumulated. In the first 3 seasons, cutaways were ornaments on stories that had their own structural integrity. The plots had beginnings, middles, and ends. The characters developed through actual conflict and resolution. The cutaways added flavor without replacing the substance. Starting in Season 4, this balance began changing. Episodes became lighter in their plots and heavier in their gag content. The stories connecting the cutaways grew thinner and more perfunctory, less interested in actually taking the characters somewhere that mattered. The cutaways grew longer and more numerous and more central to what was actually happening in any given episode. By some analyses of later season episodes, removing all the cutaway content would leave barely 10 minutes of actual story in a 22-minute episode. The show was becoming a highlights reel rather than a show, a collection of moments strung together by the thinnest possible connective tissue. Seasons 4 and 5 still produced strong individual episodes. Road to Rupert is still talked about warmly by fans who have otherwise largely moved on from the show. Barely Legal showed the writing room capable of sharp, character-grounded work when it committed to that approach. But the average episode was already feeling lighter and more obviously in the business of delivering jokes than of telling stories. The creative urgency that had characterized the original run, the sense that the people making the show had something they needed to show you and were working hard to show it, was beginning to diffuse into something more professional and less personal. The character dynamics were shifting in ways that would become much more visible in later seasons. Peter's intelligence was pushing further downward than it had gone in the original seasons, where he was foolish but recognizably human. Brian's political opinions were taking up more of the available character space at the expense of his other qualities. Stewie's evil genius persona, which had been the most purely original creation on the entire show, was being quietly and deliberately wound down by writers who felt they had taken the concept as far as it could reasonably go. The Season 6 two-part story Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie was, in retrospect, both a celebration of the original character and a farewell to him. Stewie finally follows through on his life's work and apparently kills Lois. She turns out to be alive and comes back for revenge. The episodes are thrilling and dark and funny in a way the show had not been for a while. They gave the audience everything they had been waiting to see from that original character for years. Then the twist revealed it had all been a simulation on Stewie's computer. None of it actually happened, everything reset. After those episodes, the evil genius Stewie appeared only in smaller and increasingly rare doses. The writers had made a conscious decision to retire the most original character concept on the show because they believed they had exhausted it. The argument that the evil baby joke had run its course does not hold up particularly well when you consider how long the show subsequently ran with the replacement version of Stewie. Family Guy has produced far more seasons with the softer, more emotionally accessible Stewie than it ever did with the evil genius version. If there was enough material for 15+ more seasons of gentle Stewie, it seems reasonable to wonder whether there might have been enough material for a few more seasons of a character who was building laser weapons in his crib and plotting to take over the world. The possibilities for a genuinely evil baby genius are not obviously more limited than the possibilities for an emotionally vulnerable child who happens to occasionally remember he used to have a time machine. What had definitively changed by the end of the revival's early years, and what never fully came back, was the feeling that a singular creative vision was guiding the work. The early seasons felt guided by someone with a specific point of view. The revival seasons felt more like the output of a well-organized creative committee, capable of producing good work, but missing the particular electricity that comes when a single person is making something because they urgently need to say it. Section 3. When South Park declared war on manatees. In the spring of 2006, roughly a year into Family Guy's triumphant return from cancellation, Trey Parker and Matt Stone sat down and wrote what amounts to the most elaborately constructed and publicly delivered aesthetic attack on a competitor show in the history of American animated television. They were not even slightly subtle about what they were doing, and they did not particularly care who knew it. The two-part South Park episode called Cartoon Wars aired on April 5th and 12th of 2006 during the 10th season of their Comedy Central series. On its surface, it engaged with the controversy surrounding a fictional upcoming Family Guy episode that would depict the Prophet Muhammad, tied to the real-world uproar over a Danish newspaper having published editorial cartoons featuring Muhammad in late 2005, a publication that had sparked protests and, in some cases, violent demonstrations across parts of the Muslim world. Parker and Stone used that controversy to stage a conversation about censorship. about what comedy is allowed to show on television, about the limits of cultural deference to religious sensitivity. That was the framing, but the Muhammad material was scaffolding for what they actually wanted to do, which was make a formal and very specific argument about Family Guy's writing quality, delivered through the most inflammatory character in their regular cast. In the episode, Eric Cartman infiltrates the Family Guy studio building and discovers the show's secret. The writers of Family Guy are not writers at all. They are manatees, actual sea mammals living in a large water tank, who spend their days selecting beach balls from a giant pile and running them through a machine. Each ball has a word or phrase printed on it, a noun, a verb, a pop culture reference. The manatees take 5 balls at random and feed them into a machine, and the machine generates a Family Guy cutaway gag from whichever 5 balls happen to come together that particular moment. The sequence shown as an example produces a gag involving a date in Mexico with Gary Coleman, an illustration of the purely arbitrary nature of the joke construction. The specific balls chosen are completely interchangeable with any other balls, and the resulting gag would be equally valid regardless of which combination occurred. The argument being made was precise and formal and could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. Family Guy's cutaways had no relationship to character, no connection to the emotional content of the episode they appeared in, no investment in making any observation about anything. You could swap any ball for any other ball and produce an equally valid cutaway. The gags were interchangeable in a way that revealed their fundamental nature. And if any joke could be replaced by any other joke without anything fundamentally changing about the episode, then the jokes had no real function in the show. They were noise organized to sound like comedy. Cartman says it explicitly in the episode, in language that leaves nothing ambiguous. His own jokes, he explains, are inherent to a story. They are deep situational jokes based on what is actually happening, relevant to the characters and the circumstances they find themselves in. Not just one random interchangeable joke after another, disconnected from everything around them. This was Parker and Stone delivering a formal aesthetic critique through the most inflammatory and committed character in their regular ensemble, and making sure the argument was stated clearly enough that nobody watching could mistake what they were saying. The response from the broader animation community was immediate and surprisingly candid. Parker and Stone said later that following the broadcast of the first part of the episode, both the Simpsons writing room and the King of the Hill writing room had reached out to express their appreciation. The Simpsons team reportedly sent flowers. King of the Hill team members told Parker and Stone they were doing God's work. Parker described what he called an animation solidarity moment, where everyone in primetime animation apparently had feelings about Family Guy's approach to comedy that they had not previously been saying publicly. The shows that competed with Family Guy for the same audience on the same network on the same Sunday night were more than comfortable seeing the critique delivered with this level of visibility and specificity. McFarlane's response was notably graceful and, in retrospect, quite revealing about his own awareness of the validity of the criticism. At a Harvard University commencement address in June of 2006, speaking in character as Stewie Griffin, he acknowledged the accuracy of the manatee observation. He said the cutaways and flashbacks had nothing to do with the story, that they were shallow indulgences, and that South Park was entirely right to hold itself above them, and that he saluted them for doing so. In a 2012 interview with Rolling Stone, he went further and called the episode funny and accurate. What he found less comfortable were the personal attacks that Parker and Stone made in press interviews outside of the show's comedic frame, statements about him specifically and about his character that felt to him like genuine hostility rather than aesthetic disagreement. Parker would eventually state flatly, in a way that left very little room for charitable interpretation, that he and Stone had seen Family Guy and genuinely hated it. This was not a joke or a performance position or a publicity-generating provocation. It was a statement of honest aesthetic displeasure delivered without the cushion of comedic framing. And in the context of everything that came after, the manatee critique aged in a particular and telling way. If the description felt slightly exaggerated in 2006, when the show was still producing strong individual episodes that gave the lie to pure randomness, it looked considerably more precise by 2015 and 2018 and 2022. As the cutaways kept getting longer and more numerous, and the plots kept thinning, and the sense of random gag assembly kept deepening, The episode that had looked like hyperbolic parody in 2006 increasingly resembled an accurate assessment with every subsequent season of the show. The long-term impact of Cartoon Wars on Family Guy's reputation is difficult to overstate. The manatee image stuck in a way that very few comedic criticisms of anything have managed to stick across time. It entered the vocabulary for discussing the show and stayed there permanently. When critics and fans wanted to describe the feeling that a particular later season cutaway had been assembled without real thought or comedic purpose, the words were right there, ready to use. The tanks, the balls, the machine. People who had never consciously analyzed why certain jokes felt empty now had a vivid and memorable image for the feeling, and it was an image they did not forget. The show itself eventually acknowledged the South Park critique directly in a 2009 episode called Spies Reminiscent of Us, which included a scene where Peter's out-of-context pre-written gags at an improv show received enormous laughs from the audience, while the structured improvisational work received nothing. The bit was deliberately pointing back at the Cartoon Wars criticism, suggesting that audiences actually preferred and responded better to the random gag approach than to carefully constructed story-based comedy. It worked moderately as a piece of comedic counter-programming but felt somewhat defensive in a way that undercut its effectiveness, and it did not change the underlying reality that the original critique had found something real and had stayed there. The South Park War was not simply a feud between competing shows fighting for audience share. It was a public articulation of a creative argument that the animation industry had been having internally for years without a clear vocabulary for discussing it. It put into wide circulation, in the most memorable possible form, a specific critique of what Family Guy's signature format was actually doing to comedy as a practice. Whether or not one agreed with Parker and Stone's aesthetic position, and reasonable people could disagree, the argument was serious and the evidence assembled for it was specific and persistently accurate. A show can acknowledge that a critique is accurate and then continue doing the thing being critiqued, which is essentially what Family Guy did for the next decade and a half. The manatees kept picking up their balls, the machine kept generating cutaways, and the gap between what the show had been in its best early seasons and what it had become kept widening in ways that confirmed the assessment rather than refuting it. Section 4. The FCC, the PTC, and 20 years of being the worst show on television. From its very first broadcast, Family Guy had a relationship with conservative media watchdog organizations that could only be described as sustained, adversarial, and remarkably consistent across nearly 2 decades of programming. The Parents Television Council, a nonprofit organization founded in the mid-1990s to advocate for more family-friendly content in primetime television, took an interest in Family Guy almost immediately after it premiered, and maintained that interest with extraordinary persistence through season after season. The PTC had a methodology they had developed and refined over years of monitoring broadcast content. They watched primetime programming, identified material they considered indecent or harmful to family viewers, documented it in formal reports and press releases, and mobilized their membership to file complaints with the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC had the authority, under broadcast indecency standards, to levy fines against networks that aired material deemed patently offensive by community standards. By generating large volumes of viewer complaints from motivated members, the PTC could force investigations and create regulatory pressure that might influence network programming decisions over time. The PTC placed Family Guy on their most problematic programming list at least 40 times between 2005 and the mid-2010s. Not 40 episodes, not 40 specific moments, 40 separate formal designations of the show as one of the worst programs being broadcast on American television. This was not occasional commentary from a group that had noticed something objectionable. This was a sustained, organized, decade-long project of cataloging and formally objecting to the show's content, with the explicit goal of creating enough regulatory and public pressure to change what was being aired. The first major FCC indecency complaint following the show's revival came in January of 2005, targeting a rebroadcast of an earlier episode. The FCC investigated and declined to pursue formal action, finding the episode did not meet the legal threshold for actionable broadcast indecency. The legal standard required content to be graphic and explicit and patently offensive by community standards in a very specific way, involving descriptions or depictions of sexual organs or excretory activities in a manner clearly designed to be shocking or titillating. Family Guy's approach to adult content, however offensive it might have been to viewers and advocacy organizations, consistently managed to approach but not clearly cross that specific legal line. This became the standard pattern. The PTC filed. The FCC investigated. The FCC declined to act. The complaints did not stop the show from airing. They did not result in fines. But they created a permanent background context in which Family Guy existed, one in which every episode was being watched not only by fans and critics but by a monitoring apparatus that was documenting and formally objecting to its content, season by season. The episode PTV from Season 4, which satirized the FCC and broadcast censorship directly, generated a specific PTC campaign where the organization mobilized its members to file complaints about an episode that was itself about the complaint process. The episode depicted a world where Peter started his own television network to escape the reach of network censorship standards, and it included extensive parody of what the FCC formally prohibited. The show was directly making fun of the regulatory system being used to try to restrict it, and the PTC found this approach genuinely outrageous. The result was a feedback loop of almost perfect circularity, a show being complained about for an episode complaining about being complained about. In 2010, the PTC filed a formal complaint against the episode Brian and Stewie, which was actually one of the most praised and critically celebrated episodes the show produced during its entire post-revival run. The episode was unusual in the show's catalog, a rare experimental episode with no cutaways and no non-sequitur gags. Just Brian and Stewie locked in a bank vault overnight and having real, sustained, emotionally honest conversations about their lives and their friendship and their deepest fears. Brian revealed he kept a gun in a safety deposit box because he had thought about ending his own life. Stewie revealed how much Brian meant to him in terms that went beyond comedy into something genuinely affecting. The episode was raw and genuine and completely unlike anything else Family Guy had ever attempted. PTC President Tim Winter stated publicly that the episode appeared designed to find the exact legal definition of broadcast indecency and violate it as literally as possible. The episode being specifically criticized was arguably the show's most genuinely artistic post-revival achievement, a demonstration that Family Guy could sustain real character work over an entire runtime without reaching for easy jokes. The very episode that was least like what the PTC typically criticized Family Guy for was still being treated as though it were the same kind of thing as whatever had generated the previous complaint. Between 2012 and 2015, the PTC tallied what it described as at least 58 jokes involving child sex abuse material embedded in the show's cutaway gags, a number they presented in a formal report arguing that the accumulated exposure represented a pattern of normalizing harmful attitudes toward children. Whether or not one accepts that precise framing, the documentation exercise revealed something about how the show's content had genuinely shifted over the years. The early seasons had pushed against broadcast standards in ways that were edgy but rarely dwelt at length on the specific categories that generated the most serious concerns. The later seasons had developed habits around certain types of humor that were harder to defend on creative grounds, material that seemed to exist primarily for shock value rather than for any satirical or comedic purpose that could be clearly articulated. MacFarlane and the show's producers consistently pushed back against PTC characterizations, framing the criticism as an attempt to use government regulatory power to impose one segment of society's values on all broadcast audiences. Executive producer David Goodman said in response to PTC complaints that Family Guy was absolutely made for adults and that he personally did not allow his own children to watch it. This was both an honest statement about the show's intended audience and a somewhat unsatisfying response to the question of how parents were practically supposed to prevent children from encountering broadcast television content in an era before widespread streaming parental controls. The FCC complaints around various episodes generally ended the same way, with the commission finding insufficient grounds for formal sanction. Family Guy continued to air through decades of complaints and formal objections, which was in some ways a confirmation that the show had correctly identified where the actual legal line was and had managed to operate just beside it rather than across it. But the sustained public attention generated by the complaint campaigns created a permanent cloud around the show's reputation that affected how it was discussed in certain quarters, and the question of whether the show was doing anything interesting with its edgier content or merely exploiting the space it had found became harder to answer charitably as the seasons accumulated. Section 5. The Writer's Strike, Fox's Betrayal, and 3 episodes nobody wanted aired. November of 2007. The Writers Guild of America went on strike after months of negotiations with the major studios broke down over compensation for what the studios were calling new media. The core of the dispute was that writers wanted fair compensation for DVD sales, digital downloads, and the internet streaming that everyone in the industry could see was coming quickly. The studios wanted to maintain the position that these were uncharted formats and that existing contract terms should continue while the landscape developed. The writers had heard this argument before, about VHS in the 1980s and then about DVD in the 1990s, and both times the format had turned out to be enormously profitable, while writers received very little of that profit because they had agreed not to press for compensation while things were still developing. They were not interested in being patient about it a third time. The strike began the 5th of November 2007. More than 10,000 television and film writers in the United States stopped working. The effects were immediate across the entire industry. Television shows that were mid-season suddenly had no new scripts coming in. Late-night comedy programs, which generate new material daily, went dark or switched to formats that did not require guild members to write them. Scripted dramas and comedies began running out of completed episodes. The entire architecture of American scripted television production came to a halt, in ways that affected everything from drama to reality programming to animated shows. MacFarlane joined the strike without apparent hesitation and without any visible agonizing over the decision. He appeared on picket lines outside the Fox studio. He gave interviews expressing support for the Guild's position. He was, by the accounts of people who were present during that period, one of the most prominent and visible creator-level voices in solidarity with the striking writers. His support was not political calculation or an attempt to stay in good standing with the creative community. His history of advocacy for writers' rights went back years before the strike, and his actions during the work stoppage reflected what appeared to be a genuine sense of solidarity with the people who did the actual writing on his shows and who deserved to be fairly compensated for their work. Fox looked at the Family Guy production pipeline and found 3 episodes in various stages of completion that had been substantially worked on before the strike began. The network's position was that since these episodes had been substantially produced before the work stoppage, and since MacFarlane's primary contractual obligation for those specific episodes was voice performance rather than writing work, they could proceed without his final creative input and put the completed episodes on the air during the sweeps period. MacFarlane found out what Fox intended to do and described it in the restrained public language he used at the time as something the network had never done before and as something that was going to be genuinely damaging to their relationship if they went through with it. They went through with it. The first episode was Padre de Familia, followed by Peter's Daughter. A third episode, McStroke, was completed during the strike period and aired shortly after the Guild and the studios reached their agreement. MacFarlane acknowledged in interviews that Fox was within its technical legal rights. His contract obligated him to contribute to episodes the network subsequently produced, and Fox had not clearly violated anything on paper. But legal right and moral right are different things, and MacFarlane made clear which side of that line he felt the network had landed on, and that the distinction mattered to him considerably. Fox had made a calculated business decision. They weighed the commercial value of airing new content during the sweeps period against the cost of damaging their relationship with the creator of one of their most commercially valuable animated properties, and they decided the new content was worth the relationship damage. This was not a malicious choice in any simple sense. It was a business choice made by people whose job was to protect the network's commercial interests. But business choices have consequences that extend beyond their immediate commercial logic, and this one had consequences that neither party fully appreciated at the time they were made. The strike ended the 12th of February, 2008, after approximately 3 months. A new agreement was reached that included improved compensation rates for digital distribution. Not everything the writers had asked for, but enough to settle the dispute and return people to work. MacFarlane returned to the show. On the surface, production resumed as though the interruption had been a weather delay rather than a fundamental revelation about the nature of the relationship between creator and network. Underneath the surface, the relationship between MacFarlane and Fox had shifted in a way that the network probably did not fully appreciate at the time. The strike had revealed something permanent and unambiguous about where MacFarlane stood in the hierarchy of the relationship he was in. When Fox was forced to choose between its business needs and the explicit preferences of the person who had created its most valuable animated property, it chose its business needs without extensive deliberation. MacFarlane had been a highly visible and publicly committed strike supporter, which made the decision to air his episodes over his explicit objections specifically pointed and symbolic. This was not simply a contractual dispute about the terms of a production agreement. It was a demonstration, delivered clearly, of how the network understood the balance of power between them. This was filed away. The 2008 contract deal worth approximately $100 million to keep Family Guy and American Dad on Fox through 2012 was signed after the strike ended, which in isolation looked like a moment of reconciliation and renewed commitment. But the strike had introduced a crack in the relationship that no dollar figure could fully fill. MacFarlane kept doing his job. He voiced the characters. He maintained his executive producer role. He appeared at the press events and gave the interviews and continued to be publicly associated with the show in all the ways that mattered commercially. What quietly changed was his level of active creative engagement with the day-to-day production of the show. By his own account, given during a 2017 Reddit Ask Me Anything session, he had not written for the show since 2010. He clarified that he remained involved in production and voice work, but the actual creative labor of developing stories and writing scripts had been handed to others. The showrunning duties went to Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, experienced Family Guy veterans and capable professionals who had been with the show for years. But there is a substantial difference between running a show that someone else built from the ground up and being the person who built it. The show had competent caretakers. It no longer had its original architect, and the absence was eventually felt in the accumulated texture of what got made. Section 6. Brian Griffin dies, and the internet does not take it well. On the 24th of November, 2013, the 6th episode of the 12th season of Family Guy killed its dog. And the internet reacted in ways that briefly made the death of an animated cartoon character into a genuine national news story. Brian Griffin had been on Family Guy since before the first episode aired on Super Bowl Sunday in 1999. He was part of the original pitch demo that MacFarlane had created on his minimal budget. He was embedded in the concept before the concept existed as a television show. He was the smart one, the grounded one, the character who looked at the Griffin family's dysfunction with wry intelligence and functioned as the audience's surrogate in a world full of people making consistently bad decisions for consistently insufficient reasons. In the original seasons, he was genuinely affecting in his failures as a writer and his quiet longing for a life he could not quite reach. His friendship with Peter in the early years and his friendship with Stewie in the later ones provided the emotional architecture around which much of the show's most effective storytelling was built. For a large portion of the audience, Brian was the reason they stayed with Family Guy even in the later seasons, when other aspects of the show had begun to disappoint them in ways they found difficult to fully articulate. The episode Life of Brian opened with a scene establishing that Stewie had destroyed his time machine, removing the most obvious available mechanism for undoing any permanent story consequence that might occur during the episode. This, in retrospect, was deliberate. The writers were aware that fans would immediately think of the time machine as the natural tool for reversing any irreversible development, and they wanted to establish early in the episode that it was not available. Brian and Stewie then set up a street hockey net in front of the house, in a moment of domestic normalcy. Brian is playing in the street when a car comes around a corner too fast, driven by someone not paying sufficient attention, and strikes him. He is badly injured. The family rushes him to a veterinarian. The vet tells them his internal injuries are too severe to treat successfully. The family gathers in the clinical space of the examination room. Brian, struggling to speak, tells them he loves them. His eyes close. He is gone. The scene was handled with unusual and genuine sincerity for a show that had built its entire comedic identity around the principle of refusing to sustain any emotional register for more than a few seconds before inserting a deflating joke. There were no cutaways inserted to release the tension. There was no gag placed at the moment of maximum emotional weight. The Griffin family grieved, and so did Stewie, who sat alone in the dark afterward in a way that felt genuinely raw. The grief of someone who has lost a best friend, rather than the performed grief of a character fulfilling a narrative function. The episode then moved forward in time to show the family adopting a replacement dog, a tough-talking Italian greyhound named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico of Sopranos fame. The opening credits were updated to include him. The implication was clear and apparently intended to be permanent. Within hours of the episode airing, the reaction across the internet had built into something that felt genuinely unprecedented for an animated program. A petition on Change.org calling for Brian's resurrection was started almost immediately after the episode ended and gathered roughly 25,000 signatures within a few days of being posted. Fan forums and social media platforms were flooded with commentary in every direction, some expressing genuine grief, some expressing fury at the production team for making the decision, some predicting with confident specificity that this was a temporary rating stunt and Brian would be back within weeks. Some viewers obtained memorial tattoos, actual permanent body modifications, featuring phrases like "R.I.P. Brian" and images of the character. The grief was disproportionate by any rational measure of what had occurred. It was also completely genuine, built from years of watching this specific character at his best and feeling something real about who he was. McFarlane posted on Twitter the night of the episode, writing thoughtfully about the importance of not taking loved ones for granted and about how quickly they can be gone. He did not confirm or deny anything about the permanence of the situation. He expressed gratitude that people cared about the character so deeply. 3 weeks later, on December 15th, in the episode Christmas Guy, Stewie was walking through a Christmas market when he encountered a version of himself from an earlier time period who happened to be in possession of a working time machine, the same device that had been established as destroyed at the beginning of the episode where Brian died. Stewie obtained the device, traveled back to the moment before Brian's accident, pushed Brian out of the path of the oncoming car, and Brian's life was saved. Brian came back. Vinny, it turned out, had always been booked for a short run of episodes. The opening credits were restored to their previous configuration. Everything went back to exactly where it had been before Brian died. McFarlane posted on Twitter again, confirming with cheerful frankness that, of course, they had not really been going to permanently kill off Brian Griffin. The response to the resurrection was in some ways more pointed and specifically angry than the response to the death had been. The death had generated genuine emotion in people who watched it. The resurrection generated something closer to cold and specific anger about having been manipulated. McFarlane confirmed at a January 2014 Television Critics Association press tour panel that the death had accomplished what it was designed to accomplish. He noted that the season 12 premiere had been down 21% from the previous year's viewership numbers. The show needed something to generate renewed attention and engagement from both its existing audience and from people who had drifted away. Brian's death gave them enormous attention, headlines across the entertainment press, trending topics on social media for days, conversations among people who had not watched Family Guy in years. 3 weeks later, when the commercial benefit of the attention had been fully extracted, the narrative was reversed and Brian came back. Rolling Stone's reporting on the situation at the time noted the timing with characteristic directness. The season premiere numbers were significantly down from the previous year. Brian's death came at the start of the holiday season, when audience attention is elevated and merchandise sales are at their seasonal peak. The show and its network both stood to benefit commercially from the sustained conversation the death generated, and once the commercial benefit had been delivered to their satisfaction, the narrative was reversed. The Brian Griffin death and resurrection is one of the more studied examples in contemporary television analysis of how a production can manufacture emotional engagement and then immediately and completely destroy the credibility of that engagement through the speed of its reversal. It confirmed in the most public and irrefutable possible way something that the show's storytelling habits had been suggesting for years, that nothing that happened on Family Guy would be trusted to mean what it seemed to mean in the moment it happened. For a substantial portion of the audience, the Brian situation was the moment they decided to step back from the show permanently. Not because of the death itself, which had been handled with genuine craft and real emotional weight, but because the resurrection, and specifically the cheerful public confirmation that it had always been a commercial stunt, confirmed something they had been trying not to believe. The show's emotional register was permanently available for exploitation in service of business goals, and no creative development would ever be fully trusted to mean what it appeared to mean. Section 7. The Meg controversy and what a cartoon told us about cruelty. Meg Griffin was introduced in the first episode of Family Guy as a normal teenage girl. She was unpopular at school. She was not particularly interesting compared to the rest of her extraordinarily strange family. She wanted things that teenagers universally want: to be liked and seen and to matter to the people closest to her. In the original 3 seasons, the comedy around her was gentle, in the way that comedy about recognizable human experience can be gentle. She was the ordinary one in an extraordinary family, and the contrast between her mundane concerns and everyone else's chaos was itself the joke, and it was a joke that did not require cruelty to function. It just required contrast. And that contrast had something honest and recognizable in it about how many teenagers actually experience the world. Then the show discovered that making Meg suffer got a strong reaction from its audience, and the years of misuse that followed represent one of the most uncomfortable, sustained creative decisions in the history of American animated television. The escalation can be traced with some precision through the seasons. Season 4, the year of the revival, saw the first significant shift. Jokes about Meg moved from her boring personality to her physical appearance, with characters reacting to her presence with expressions of open disgust. This was a meaningful change because it moved the comedic target from something a character might theoretically change to something fixed, to the fact of her physical existence in the world. You cannot change how you look. Making fun of a character for being boring is one kind of comedy, one that has genuine precedent in American entertainment. Making fun of a character for existing in the body they were born with is a meaningfully crueler kind, and the show jumped into it with considerable enthusiasm over the seasons that followed. By seasons 8 through 14, the treatment of Meg had become one of the defining features of the entire show in ways that were impossible to ignore. Peter was physically abusing her for comedic effect. He was making statements about wishing she had not been born. A flashback revealed he and Lois had attempted to abandon infant Meg at a fire station, a scene played entirely as a comedic revelation about the family's history. Every member of the Griffin household was united in contempt for her in ways that went beyond the ordinary friction of family dynamics. Teachers at her school mistreated her. Random strangers in the town were hostile to her without discernible reason. The entire fictional universe had reached a consensus about Meg Griffin's value, and the consensus was that she had essentially none, and that this fact was inherently funny. Mila Kunis, who had been voicing Meg since the 2nd season, spoke in interviews about real-world consequences of this fictional dynamic that she had personally experienced. People would come up to her in public and deploy the dismissive catchphrase that had become associated with Meg's abuse on the show, the line Peter used to shut down her presence and contributions to any conversation. They would say it to the actual human woman who gave the character her voice, apparently as a form of greeting or as a demonstration of their familiarity with the show. The comedy that existed within the frame of the cartoon had crossed into the actual world and was being used as a way of communicating to a real person that her presence was similarly unwelcome. The fictional cruelty had become a social script that real people were deploying against real people. The season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party became the most debated individual entry in the entire Meg storyline. Trapped together during a hurricane with no way to leave, Meg finally confronts her family and tells them exactly what she thinks of them after years of accumulated abuse. The speech she delivers is not exaggerated or dramatically unfair. Every specific accusation she makes refers to things the show has actually depicted on screen in previous episodes. She is not being dramatic or unreasonable. She is describing reality with the specific and exhausted clarity of someone who has been absorbing punishment long enough to have a very detailed picture of what that punishment consists of. For fans who had watched the character absorb punishment for years, the scene was genuinely cathartic. It felt like the show was finally going to acknowledge what it had been doing. The episode then ended by having Meg voluntarily retract everything she had said and agree to return to her role as the family's shared punching bag, because without her absorbing that function, the family turned on each other and their dynamic collapsed. She accepted that her suffering created stability for everyone else. The family needed someone to be cruel to, and Meg's willingness to resume that role was framed as a form of generosity. The implications were noticed almost immediately. The message encoded in the resolution communicates that victims of sustained abuse should accept that role because their suffering provides stability for others, that standing up for yourself disrupts the people who have been hurting you and is therefore a form of selfishness, and that the responsible thing is to quietly return to absorbing the harm rather than making others deal with the consequences of refusing to absorb it. This is a troubling message to deliver through any narrative, and the fact that the show appeared to be delivering it without apparent awareness of what it was saying made it more troubling rather than less. What makes the Meg situation especially difficult to evaluate is the clear evidence that the writers possessed of a different and better approach when they chose to use it. A crossover episode with The Simpsons in season 13 gave Meg a storyline where she connected with Lisa Simpson, discovered a genuine musical talent, and was treated throughout as a person with value and depth. An episode called Peter's Sister in season 14 traced Peter's cruelty toward Meg back to his own history of being abused by his sister, gave both characters genuine psychological complexity, and allowed a real moment of understanding between them. These episodes prove that the capacity to see Meg as more than a target existed in the writing room and could produce genuinely strong television when the writers chose to exercise it. The writers kept choosing not to exercise that capacity for the majority of the show's middle run. Around seasons 14 and 15, the worst of the abuse began to diminish. People who follow the show's production history credit this partly to the addition of more women to the writing staff, who pushed back against the sustained cruelty and advocated for giving the character actual storylines with actual dignity. By season 22 and beyond, Meg was receiving episodes where she was competent, resilient, and occasionally genuinely impressive. The improvement was real and visible. But for roughly 10 seasons, the show had been communicating something through sheer repetition that went beyond what any individual episode intended to say. Section 8. Seth MacFarlane vs. Fox and the long public divorce. The story of Seth MacFarlane's relationship with Fox is the story of a professional partnership that should probably have ended earlier than it did but could not, because the financial and contractual entanglements were too thoroughly embedded in both parties' operations to simply walk away from, and because the commercial logic of the arrangement remained intact long after the creative and personal logic had ceased to function in any meaningful way. MacFarlane had always been politically liberal. This was not a secret or a revelation to anyone who watched his shows. Brian Griffin's social attitudes in the original seasons were a softer and more grounded version of MacFarlane's own worldview. The show's satire of religious conservatism, of military culture, of certain political figures and institutions, all of it pointed toward a creator whose perspective was identifiably and consistently left of center. Fox, the broadcast network, had historically been willing to air programming that did not align with Fox News' editorial positions, because the entertainment and news divisions operated with meaningful separation, despite sharing corporate ownership. The Simpsons had been making fun of Republican politics in various ways for 3 decades without generating significant corporate tension. The problem was that Fox News was getting louder and more aggressively political through the 2010s, and the shared branding was creating associations that MacFarlane found increasingly impossible to compartmentalize into different mental categories. When Tucker Carlson told his viewers in 2018 to always assume the opposite of whatever they were hearing from mainstream news organizations, telling them specifically not to consult multiple sources and not to use their critical faculties, MacFarlane went on Twitter and wrote that this was fringe content, that the advice was to stop thinking critically and to not use your brain, and that the business of Fox News producing this kind of programming was what made him embarrassed to work for the same company. A Fox News executive responded almost immediately with a point that was fair if not particularly charitable, noting that MacFarlane did not appear to be quite embarrassed enough to decline the substantial compensation his relationship with the company provided. MacFarlane did not respond to this directly. He continued making Family Guy for Fox. He continued receiving whatever financial arrangements governed his participation in the show. The $200 million deal with NBC Universal in January of 2020 was the statement MacFarlane had been building toward for years, even if he had not publicly framed it that way. His production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, was now developing its future work entirely outside the Fox universe. The Orville, his science fiction passion project, had already migrated from Fox to Hulu after its first 2 seasons. The Ted prequel series for Peacock was going to a platform with no connection to Fox's corporate family. Everything new he was building was being built somewhere else, in a creative environment he had chosen because it did not come with the associations he found objectionable. Family Guy remained on Fox. It was always going to remain on Fox. The show's production history, licensing deals, broadcast contracts, and entire commercial infrastructure were embedded in that relationship in ways that could not be extracted simply because its creator had emotionally moved on. MacFarlane continued to voice the characters. He continued to be listed as executive producer. He maintained the professional relationship his contracts required while building his creative future elsewhere. In August of 2021, he made the situation fully public in a way that could not be walked back or reframed as something else. In response to Tucker Carlson's latest commentary, MacFarlane wrote on Twitter that the content once again made him wish Family Guy was on any other network. He described the relationship with Fox as a failing marriage, noting that the sex happened only once a year, that he did not get along with their mother, and that he had been having an affair with NBC. The metaphor was considered and deliberate. It was not an impulsive tweet dashed off in a moment of irritation. It was a statement designed to be widely circulated, and it was. Fox did not respond publicly in any meaningful way. The show was still being made. MacFarlane still showed up to record his voice. The commercial relationship was still functional and profitable for both parties. The creative and personal relationship had clearly deteriorated past the point of comfortable description, but commercial relationships can survive creative deterioration as long as the underlying numbers stay workable, and the underlying numbers stayed workable because of streaming and syndication revenue that had nothing to do with how either party felt about the other. In April of 2025, the 4-season mega deal through 2028 to 2029 was announced with institutional enthusiasm. MacFarlane was named in the announcements. He described his connection to the show with the measured and professional language of someone who has made peace with a complicated situation rather than the energized language of someone excited about a creative future. The show would continue through its 30th anniversary. The machine would keep running. Section 9. Stolen jokes, derivative material, and the originality question. When a show produces the volume of jokes per episode that Family Guy's cutaway-heavy format demands, across more than 400 episodes spanning more than 2 decades, the question of originality becomes something that cannot be avoided indefinitely. At some point, the probability of independently arriving at a joke that someone else has already arrived at becomes statistically significant. And then there is the separate and considerably harder question of jokes that were not independently arrived at all. Over the years, Family Guy accumulated a recurring pattern of accusations from working comedians who recognized specific constructions, premises, or complete bits in the show's cutaway gags that matched material they had used in their own work. Jimmy Carr was among the more prominent voices raising this concern at different points, noting in interviews that certain Family Guy gags bore a suspicious similarity to his own stand-up material. He was not alone in making this observation. Various other working comedians and comedy writers made similar claims at different points in the show's history, describing the specific and uncomfortable experience of watching a cutaway and recognizing something they could trace back to their own work or to material they were personally familiar with from other sources. The challenge with comedy theft accusations is the fundamental difficulty of proof. Jokes do not come with timestamps or registration numbers. Comedy is a tradition in which similar observations emerge independently from multiple sources, because comedians are all responding to the same cultural landscape, watching the same films and news events and social phenomena, and arriving at similar angles on similar material through independent paths. The question of who did it first is often genuinely unresolvable, particularly when the accused parties deny any knowledge of the original source. What made the accusations against Family Guy more persistent than the ordinary background noise of comedians claiming influence was the specific nature of the show's production environment. The cutaway format required an enormous number of jokes per episode, significantly more than a conventionally structured comedy would need. Writers were producing at high volume under consistent deadline pressure across multiple seasons simultaneously. The incentives in that environment push naturally toward efficiency, toward using material that works rather than toward generating purely original material in every instance. When you need to fill a certain number of cutaway gag slots per episode, and you need to do it week after week for more than 2 decades, the probability of consciously or unconsciously incorporating material from elsewhere increases in ways that are difficult to monitor. Entertainment Weekly's very first review of the show in 1999 included the phrase "stolen ideas" among its criticisms, identifying this as a concern essentially from the beginning before there was any substantial body of work to analyze. The South Park Manatee episode in 2006 made an adjacent and related argument that the gags were too disconnected from character and story to reflect genuine creative investment, that the show was assembling material rather than generating it. These two observations from different sources years apart pointed toward the same underlying concern about the show's relationship to original creative work. Family Guy's defenders made arguments that were not without merit and should not be dismissed. All comedy builds on prior comedy. No style or format emerges from nothing. The specific assemblage of references and gags that made up a Family Guy episode might draw on a wide range of sources, but the assemblage itself was a creative act with its own character. The show was doing something recognizable and distinct with the material it incorporated, not simply reproducing it. Whether this defense was adequate depended on where you drew the line between legitimate influence and something harder to justify, a line that is genuinely difficult to draw, and that different people drew in different places based on different values about what creative work obligates. The originality question contributed to a persistent, low-level skepticism about whether the show was engaged in genuine creative labor or something closer to creative mining, extracting existing material and reformatting it in ways that generated commercial value for the show, without sharing credit or compensation with the sources. This skepticism, even when it could not be substantiated in any specific instance, colored the way critics and industry professionals talked about the show and contributed to the sense that Family Guy occupied a different tier from the animated comedies it existed alongside. Section 10. Episodes pulled, banned, and lost in American television. The history of Family Guy's censorship battles is the history of a show that regularly pushed against the edge of what broadcast television would tolerate and occasionally found that edge, sometimes with consequences that lasted for years. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was the first major censorship battle in the show's history, a completely finished episode that Fox pulled from the schedule in 2000 over concern that its approach to Jewish stereotyping would generate accusations of anti-Semitism. The episode followed Peter Griffin developing the belief that having a Jewish accountant would solve his financial problems, based on the stereotype that Jewish people are better with money. He befriends a man named Max Weinstein, voiced by Ben Stein, and the episode included a musical number called I Need a Jew, a parody of the Disney standard When You Wish Upon a Star. McFarlane's stated intent was satirical, the humor coming from the absurdity of Peter's reasoning rather than from endorsing his stereotypes. Fox was not confident the audience would read it that way and pulled the episode before it aired. It sat in a vault for 3 years, eventually airing on Adult Swim in 2003 and on Fox in 2004. The episode also generated a copyright lawsuit. Born Co., music publishers, which holds the United States copyright on When You Wish Upon a Star, filed suit against Fox in October of 2007, arguing that the parody song used the copyrighted melody without sufficient legal justification. Born argued the parody did not meet the fair use standard because it was not specifically commenting on the original song itself. A federal judge ruled in Fox's favor in March of 2009, finding the transformation sufficient and the parody legally protected under existing copyright law. Fox won, and the episode remained available. But the lawsuit confirmed that the show's approach to using other people's intellectual property would generate ongoing friction with rights holders. A separate lawsuit arrived in March of 2007 from comedian Carol Burnett, who sued over the show's use of a parody of her charwoman character from her long-running variety show, placed in a context involving adult content that Burnett described as demeaning and unauthorized. Fox prevailed in this case as well. The Carol Burnett situation generated significant press attention because Burnett was a widely respected figure whose objection to the use of her likeness was received with more public sympathy than an abstract intellectual property. Dispute might have been. Partial terms of endearment represented the most complete example of Fox simply refusing to put a completed and ready episode on American television. The show had been made, was technically ready to broadcast, and Fox decided it should not air in the United States. The episode followed Lois agreeing to be a surrogate for an old college friend, with the friend and her husband dying in an accident and leaving Lois to navigate the question of what to do with the pregnancy. The episode approached abortion with considerably more care and genuine balance than typical Family Guy fare. Critics who saw it through the BBC broadcast in the United Kingdom, where it aired without incident, or through the DVD release of the season, generally found it thoughtful and genuinely engaging, a real treatment of a difficult topic rather than mere shock humor dressed up as social commentary. MacFarlane staged a live table read of the episode in Hollywood before the ban was formally announced, turning the censorship into a public event that generated its own press coverage. The episode remained unavailable on American television and was subsequently excluded from Hulu when the show moved to streaming, making Partial Terms of Endearment the only episode among more than 400 that Americans cannot access through the show's standard streaming home as of 2026. Turban Cowboy became the most dramatically visible censorship event in terms of real-world impact. The episode aired legally on the 17th of March 2013 and included a cutaway gag showing Peter driving his car through the Boston Marathon finish line. A completely separate and unconnected scene in the same episode involved remote detonated explosions as part of a different storyline with no relationship to the marathon material. On the 15th of April 2013, the actual Boston Marathon was bombed. 3 people were killed and more than 260 were wounded. In the days that followed, someone edited the 2 completely unrelated scenes from Turban Cowboy together to create a clip that appeared to show Family Guy having predicted or described the bombing in advance. The edited clip circulated widely, pushed by conspiracy theorists. MacFarlane condemned it immediately and explicitly. Fox pulled the episode from all streaming platforms and worked with YouTube to remove manipulated versions. The episode eventually returned to availability in 2014, but its association with the conspiracy theory and the real-world tragedy left a permanent mark on its history within the show's catalog. Section 11. The Voice Actor Reckonings and Who Gets to Play Whom. In the summer of 2020, as American society engaged in a sustained and serious reckoning with racial justice following the killing of George Floyd, the question of who should voice animated characters of color became one of the most active conversations across the entertainment industry, and Family Guy found itself directly at the center of it. Mike Henry had been the voice of Cleveland Brown since the night Family Guy first aired in 1999. More than 20 years in the same role, through the full run of the main series and through 4 seasons of the Cleveland Show spin-off that ran from 2009 to 2013. Henry is a white man. Cleveland Brown is a black man. In American animation, this had historically been treated as standard professional practice. Voice acting was understood as a performance craft, and skilled voice actors played characters across racial and ethnic lines as a routine matter of the profession, with the understanding that the vocal performance was the art form being evaluated, rather than the biographical correspondence between performer and character. The summer of 2020 changed the terms of this understanding across entertainment in ways that were immediate and industry-wide. Animation was specifically asked to confront whether having white actors voice black characters, even in contexts where no one had previously raised formal objections, was something that needed to change as part of a broader reckoning with representation and opportunity across the creative industries. Henry did not wait for external pressure to force the issue. He announced on the 26th of June, 2020, that he was stepping down from the role of Cleveland Brown. His statement was direct and clear. He said he loved the character, but that persons of color should play characters of color. He would continue voicing other characters on the show. He was making a specific decision about a specific role based on a principle he had arrived at on his own. Responses varied across a genuine spectrum that reflected the genuine complexity of the question. Some people felt Henry was doing exactly the right thing, that the summer's conversation had opened an opportunity for the industry to correct a long-standing practice that had structurally disadvantaged actors of color. Others felt the move was unnecessary, that vocal performance was a craft separate from physical performance, and that the racial background of the performer was not relevant to the quality of the characterization. Still others felt the conversation was being focused on the wrong questions entirely, that representation behind the camera in writers' rooms and production decision-making was more consequential than which actor occupied the recording booth. Arif Zahir, a YouTuber with more than 6 million subscribers who had built much of his following through Cleveland Brown impressions among other character voices, put himself forward for consideration and was cast as Cleveland's new voice beginning with the 19th season. The transition was handled publicly with genuine warmth by all parties involved. Henry welcomed Zahir explicitly and warmly. Zahir expressed deep gratitude for the opportunity. The character continued without significant disruption. What persisted as unresolved was a set of questions the situation raised but did not answer. Herbert, the elderly neighbor character voiced by Henry, who was used as a running joke about predatory attraction to children, continued in the show without similar reconsideration of whether this type of character being played for comedy was appropriate. The character had generated its own sustained stream of objections from child safety advocates for years. His continued presence while Cleveland was recast with deliberate attention to racial representation created a juxtaposition that some observers found difficult to ignore. The voice actor situation was, among the major Family Guy controversies, one of the more cleanly resolved. A decision was made, a replacement was found, the character continued, but it was also a moment that placed the show's entire history of representational choices under scrutiny that was not going to quickly dissipate, raising questions about the space between satirizing stereotypes and deploying them that the show's existing answers were not entirely adequate to address. Section 12. The Disney deal, the streaming future, and what stays when almost everything else has gone. When Fox announced in April of 2025 that Family Guy had been renewed for 4 more seasons as part of what was described as a mega deal with parent company Disney, the coverage organized itself quickly and predictably around the scale of the commitment. 4 seasons through the 2028 to 2029 television season. 15 episodes per season, alongside The Simpsons, Bob's Burgers, and The Returning American Dad. All 4 of Fox's veteran animated comedies locked in simultaneously in an unprecedented early pickup that guaranteed them all through Family Guy's 30th anniversary year. The announcement was framed in the enthusiastic institutional language of corporate celebration. The words iconic and historic and legendary and beloved appeared in multiple press statements from both sides of the deal. Seth MacFarlane was named as creator and executive producer. Showrunners Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin were named. The network and studio exchanged statements about their enduring partnership and the eternal popularity of these franchises. MacFarlane's own public statements around the deal were, by contrast, notably measured, the language of someone who has made a business arrangement rather than the language of someone excited about a creative future. What the announcement was quieter about was the specific creative question that any honest accounting of the show's current situation would need to address. Does anyone making Family Guy still have something urgent to say through it? And if not, what exactly is being made and why? MacFarlane's 2024 interview on the occasion of the show's 25th anniversary offered some honest language around this that deserves to be quoted in spirit if not in letter. He described the show as having reached what he called escape velocity, a point where it had been running long enough that there was no natural place to stop it. He noted that people still watched it and seemed to find value in it, that it generated revenue that helped fund causes he cared about, including environmental conservation work. He said there had been a time when he thought the show might need to end, and that feeling had been replaced by something more like acceptance, that the show would simply continue as long as audience demand existed to sustain it. These are reasonable things for a person to say about a creative project he built 25 years ago. They are honest and they make logical sense. They are not the things you say about something you are still burning to make. The MacFarlane, who spent 6 months with no sleep drawing in his kitchen because he had specific characters he needed to show the world, had a sense of urgency that produced a specific kind of work. The MacFarlane of 2024 had a dozen ongoing projects and was thinking about his charitable work and was, by his own characterization, continuing the show because it could continue and because people still found value in it. Both of those things are valid. They are not the same thing as creative necessity. The streaming dimension of the show's current situation goes beyond the immediate production commitment. Hulu, the primary streaming home of Family Guy, is in the process of merging with Disney Plus into a combined platform. The Family Guy library, all of it, every season stretching back to 1999, will eventually live within a Disney ecosystem. This is worth noting for its pure strangeness. a show whose entire brand identity was built on being irreverent, crude, aggressively adult, and specifically opposed to the kind of wholesome corporate entertainment that Disney has spent a century building and protecting, will have its back catalog sitting in the same digital space as Toy Story and Cinderella and every Marvel Studios film ever produced. The juxtaposition is inherently comic and would probably have delighted the writers of the original seasons. The Hulu-exclusive holiday specials that launched in late 2024, one for Halloween and one for Christmas, represented the first deliberate experiments with streaming-first production for new Family Guy content. The show was making episodes specifically for a streaming platform rather than for broadcast, which signals where the producers and network were already thinking about the show's relationship to its audience in the years ahead. In March of 2026, Fox announced that a spin-off series called Stewie had been given a 2-season order set to premiere in the 2027 to 2028 television season. The Family Guy brand was not simply being maintained in its current form. It was being extended into new territory. A Stewie-focused spin-off would be building on the current version of the character, the emotionally accessible and relatably vulnerable Stewie, who had gradually replaced the original evil genius over the course of roughly 15 seasons. Whether that version of Stewie, the one defined by his friendship with Brian and his emotional uncertainty rather than by his laser guns and world domination schemes, can sustain his own series, is a question the show has committed to finding out. For almost a decade, Family Guy has ranked as Fox's most streamed program each season in terms of total platform viewership. The 2025 press release around the mega deal cited an average of 9.4 million viewers across platforms. This is the real audience in the contemporary media environment. Not the people watching on Wednesday nights on broadcast television when relatively few viewers tune in, but the people cycling through the available library on Hulu, picking up episodes when the mood strikes, revisiting old seasons on a rainy Sunday, discovering storylines they missed the first time, sharing specific clips on social media because something made them laugh in a way that felt worth sharing. The show's commercial value lives almost entirely in that streaming ecosystem now, and the broadcasting component that once justified its existence as a primetime property is increasingly supplementary to the larger commercial picture. The ratings history on live television tells a story of genuine and significant decline. From 22 million viewers at debut on Super Bowl Sunday to well under 1 million viewers in recent seasons, the loss of live broadcast audience represents a real change in the show's relationship to its primary original platform. The streaming numbers partially offset but do not fully counteract this decline. The audience generating those 9.4 million streaming views is not primarily watching the most recent episodes. They are watching the archive, particularly the seasons from before 2008, drawn by nostalgia and by the genuine quality of what was created in those first years. The Family Guy library's streaming value runs on fuel that was produced a long time ago by people who were genuinely excited about what they were making. All of the scandals documented across the preceding sections of this story, the Fox scheduling disasters of the early years, and the 2 cancellations and the Adult Swim resurrection, the South Park Manatee War and the FCC complaint campaigns and the banned episodes and the lawsuits, the Brian Griffin death stunt and the 3-week resurrection, the decade of megabuse and the Seahorse Seashell Party ending, McFarlane publicly comparing his relationship with Fox to a failing marriage, the voice actor reckonings of 2020, the ratings collapse and the streaming migration, and the Disney mega deal, all of these are chapters in a story about the distance that grows between what a creative thing is when it is made with urgency and what it becomes when it continues past the point where that urgency is doing the driving. Family Guy at its best was something genuinely original. It changed what animated television thought it could be and who it thought it was for. It came back from declared death twice because people refused to let go of it. It made moments that people still share and reference and quote decades after they first aired. The early seasons are still available on streaming right now, tonight, and they are still funny in a way that holds up better than most television comedy from 1999 holds up, which tells you something real about the quality of what was being created in those original years. The scandals were the price of trying to keep making something past the natural endpoint of its creative vitality, the friction that appears when commerce and art pull in different directions, and commerce wins, as it almost always does in the end when the stakes are high enough. The show is still being made. More episodes will come. The franchise will expand into a spin-off and potentially further formats. The machine will keep running for years. What runs the machine now is mostly the echo of something that used to be alive. That echo is worth something real. It keeps a lot of people employed in a difficult industry. It entertains a large and loyal streaming audience. It generates revenue that funds causes that matter in the world. These are genuine goods. They are just not the same as the thing itself. The thing itself was at the very beginning, being created by someone who had not slept properly in 6 months and who was drawing in his kitchen in the small hours because he had something he urgently needed to show the world and had finally been given the chance to show it. That feeling, the particular creative electricity of making something because you urgently need to say it, does not last forever in any creative endeavor. The question is whether what comes after it is honest about what it is. Family Guy's history, across every scandal and controversy and public falling out and creative decision and network betrayal and character decline, suggests that the answer is sometimes, and not always when it matters most. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, that genuinely means something. These are long conversations, and the fact that you stayed means you are curious and patient in ways that are worth acknowledging. If this helped you wind down tonight, please hit the like button and leave a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is where you are, because these videos reach people all over the world at all kinds of hours, and it is always a pleasure to see that. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this into the history and stories behind the television that shaped the culture we all grew up in. Sleep well wherever you are in the world tonight. Extended analysis: the creative architecture of the original seasons and why it mattered. To properly understand why the later seasons of Family Guy generated so many of the controversies outlined above, and why those controversies stung the audience in a way that comparable moments on other shows did not, you have to go back and spend some real time with what made the original 3 seasons work. Not just what was in them, but why the specific combination of elements produced something that millions of people responded to with genuine affection. The first thing to understand about Family Guy in those early seasons is that it was not simply a gag machine with a family sitcom frame around it. It had a genuine emotional architecture, a set of relationships between characters that carried real weight. Peter and Lois had a marriage that was funny because it was recognizable. She was smarter than him, more patient than him, perpetually managing the consequences of his poor decisions, and yet clearly in love with him in a way that felt earned rather than convenient. The comedy in their relationship came from the specific texture of that dynamic, from the way she would sigh and then help him anyway, from the way he would realize he had been wrong and actually try to make it right, rather than simply moving on to the next episode. Brian and Peter had a friendship that was equally specific in what made it work. Brian was the smart one, the one with aspirations that exceeded his actual accomplishments, the one who watched Peter's chaos with a mixture of affection and exhausted resignation. Their friendship was built on genuine mutual regard rather than on convenience, and the episodes that centered on that friendship in the original seasons had a warmth to them that was not simply the byproduct of competent writing. It felt like 2 characters who actually liked each other, and that feeling was communicated in specific ways through specific scenes rather than simply asserted. Stewie and Lois had the most overtly comedic relationship, built entirely on the premise that Lois had no idea her infant son was fantasizing about her destruction. Every scene between them operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Lois saw a normal, if occasionally peculiar, baby. Stewie was plotting elaborate schemes against her. The audience held both of these perspectives at once, which created a kind of dramatic irony that was itself a source of pleasure. You were always slightly ahead of Lois, always aware of what she did not know, and that awareness gave every mundane maternal interaction a slightly ominous undercurrent that made Stewie's occasional expressions of genuine affection land with unexpected weight. These relationships provided the show with genuine stakes. When something happened to damage them, it meant something. When they were repaired, that also meant something. The comedy in those early seasons was built on top of a foundation of characters whose relationships to each other were clearly defined and genuinely felt. The jokes were funnier because you cared about who was making them. The cutaway gags in those original seasons operated completely differently from how they operated in the later seasons, and the difference is not simply that there were fewer of them, though that is true. The early cutaways were almost always motivated by something happening in the main story. A character would make a comparison or a reference, and the cutaway would illustrate that comparison in a way that added something, that made the reference funnier by showing it rather than telling it, or that revealed something about the character making the comparison through the specific way the illustrated scene was framed. The cutaway was in service of the moment that prompted it. This is different in a meaningful way from a cutaway that begins with a character saying something like, "This is like that time when," and then cutting to a completely unrelated scene that has no real connection to anything happening in the story. The second kind of cutaway, which became the dominant mode in later seasons, operates by pure association. A word triggers a visual. The visual plays, the show returns to the main story. There is no relationship between the gag and the context that produced it beyond the triggering phrase, and the triggering phrase is often entirely arbitrary. The South Park Manatee episode was describing the second kind. Parker and Stone were not wrong about it. MacFarlane himself acknowledged they were not wrong about it. The first kind, which was the original kind, was genuinely different and genuinely clever, and understanding the difference helps explain why the later seasons felt so much lighter even when individual gags were technically funny. There is another dimension to the original seasons that gets less attention than the cutaways, but that was equally important. The show had a genuine sense of place. Quahog, Rhode Island was a specific fictional town with specific geography and specific recurring characters who had their own personalities and relationships to the Griffins. The Drunken Clam was a real bar with a real social function in the show's world. Joe Swanson was a specific kind of American man, a cop who used a wheelchair, dealing with specific challenges and specific relationships. Quagmire was not simply a collection of sexual jokes, but a character with a history and a worldview and a specific relationship to his friendship with Peter. Cleveland was warm and patient in ways that created genuine contrast with Peter's chaos. These characters together created a world that felt inhabited rather than sketched. When something happened in that world, it happened in a context that gave it meaning. The friendships at the Drunken Clam were not simply connective tissue between jokes. They were the social fabric of the show's fictional community, and that community gave the individual episodes a sense of taking place somewhere real rather than in a comedy vacuum. As the show aged, that sense of place eroded. The recurring characters became less themselves and more vessels for whatever joke the current episode required. Joe went from being the man everyone admired, who Peter was genuinely jealous of, to being someone whose disability was repeatedly used as the punchline rather than as one aspect of a complex character. Quagmire went from being a specific kind of charismatic rogue to being a repository of sexual humor that could be inserted into any scene where the writers needed a particular kind of joke. Cleveland went from being warmly grounded to being largely interchangeable with any supporting character the script required in a given moment. The erosion of the world's sense of specificity was directly related to the erosion of the character's sense of specificity. When characters become defined by one or two traits rather than by a full constellation of qualities, the world they inhabit becomes correspondingly thinner. And when the world becomes thinner, everything that happens in it carries less weight, which means the jokes are less funny and the emotional moments mean less, and the controversies hurt less than they might have hurt if the audience still felt they were watching people they knew. Extended analysis. The specific texture of the later season decline. The decline of Family Guy in its middle and later years has been documented extensively in fan discussions, critical essays, and the viewing figures themselves, but what is less often examined is the specific texture of how it happened, the particular ways in which the show changed at the level of individual scenes and moments, rather than at the level of large structural decisions. One of the most specific and telling changes was in how long the show let jokes run. In the original seasons, there was a clear editorial sense of when a joke had made its point, and when continuing to run it past that point would be diminishing returns. A physical gag would happen, land, and move on within a few seconds. A verbal joke would be delivered, acknowledged, and the scene would continue. The pacing was tight in a way that reflected confidence, a belief that the audience had gotten it and that there was no need to underline it further. In the later seasons, this confidence evaporated and was replaced by something closer to a structural anxiety about whether the joke had landed strongly enough. Gags that should have lasted 5 seconds began lasting 30 or 40. A scene where Peter hurt his knee became a scene where Peter sat on the ground, making the same noise for an uncomfortable length of time, long past the point where the discomfort itself had become funny. A cutaway about a character struggling with a task would continue repeating the same beat for a full minute when the beat had been clear after the first 10 seconds. This habit of running jokes until they stopped being funny and then continuing to run them until they looped back around to being funny through sheer commitment was initially something many fans found endearing. There were specific instances of it that worked brilliantly, where the extended runtime became itself the joke, a piece of metacomedy about the show's own willingness to commit to uncomfortable lengths. The Conway Twitty gags, where the show would cut to full unedited country music performances in place of actual jokes, were polarizing precisely because they took this approach to its logical extreme, replacing comedy with something that was not comedy at all, and daring the audience to find meaning in the absence. Some viewers found these moments genuinely funny in the way that anti-humor can be funny, as a form of aggressive subversion of comic expectations. Others found them tedious and revealing, evidence that the writers were padding because they did not have enough material to fill the episode with actual content. Both readings were available. The question of which reading was more accurate had no clear answer, and the show seemed comfortable leaving that question unresolved. The treatment of Brian Griffin in the later seasons deserves particular attention because his arc represents perhaps the most concentrated example of what went wrong with the show's character management. In the original seasons, Brian was genuinely intelligent. He had actually read the books he referenced. He gave advice that was thoughtful rather than simply pretentious. His failures as a writer were treated as genuinely painful rather than as comic fodder, because the show allowed him to care about his writing in a way that was real rather than performative. By the later seasons, Brian had become a different kind of character entirely. He still talked about being intelligent and literary and morally sophisticated, but the show repeatedly demonstrated through his actual actions that these were pretensions rather than genuine qualities. He was arrogant about accomplishments he had not achieved. He was moralistic about behaviors he himself engaged in. He claimed to be a good friend and then demonstrated through specific actions that he was capable of considerable casual cruelty. The episode Brian Writes a Bestseller from Season 9 is often identified as the specific moment where Brian's character collapse became irreversible. Stewie encourages Brian to write a self-help book, which becomes a massive commercial success, and Brian's response is to become contemptuous and dismissive of Stewie, the person who had believed in him and given him the encouragement that made the book possible. The selfishness and ingratitude in that specific response said something definitive about who Brian had become that was difficult to walk back from. Later episodes had Brian doing things that were worse. He let a woman and her child drown in a car because discovering she had a child meant she was likely married and therefore not available to him romantically. He gave both Chris and Stewie herpes through his own carelessness, and treated this as an inconvenience rather than a serious harm. He destroyed Stewie's beloved stuffed bear Rupert through a drunk act of casual destruction and faced essentially no consequences. Each of these episodes demonstrated a Brian who was not simply flawed, the way the original Brian had been flawed in interesting and human ways, but genuinely cruel in ways that were difficult to reconcile with any remaining sympathy for the character. Quagmire's famous speech in the episode Jerome is the New Black from Season 8, in which he catalogs exactly why he hates Brian, was widely recognized as an accurate accounting of what Brian had become. The show clearly intended for the audience to side with Quagmire in this scene. The writers knew Brian had become insufferable. They used Quagmire to say exactly what viewers were thinking. And then they used the acknowledgement as a release valve rather than as a turning point, allowing the speech to exist without requiring Brian to actually change in the episodes that followed. This pattern of the show acknowledging a problem through explicit dialogue and then continuing to enact the problem as though the acknowledgement had resolved it was one of the most specific and frustrating habits of the later seasons. The Seahorse Seashell Party did the same thing with Meg. The show created a moment that appeared to be a reckoning and then used that moment to restore the status quo rather than to change it. The audience got the catharsis of watching the problem be named without getting the resolution of watching it be addressed. This approach worked exactly once with any given character. After the first time, it became something the audience stopped investing in. Extended analysis. The business of Family Guy and why it kept going. Family Guy has been renewed multiple times when its live broadcast ratings would have been sufficient cause to cancel it if it were a live-action show. The reason it kept getting renewed has nothing to do with the quality of the current episodes and everything to do with the economics of animated programming in the streaming era. Animated shows cost significantly less to produce than live-action dramas or comedies. There are no expensive location shoots. There are no large on-screen casts requiring trailers and per diems and scheduling accommodations. There is no set to build or maintain. The voice actors record their lines in a recording booth, often separately from each other, and the results are sent to overseas animation studios that produce the finished frames based on the recorded audio and the production notes. The entire operation, from script to finished episode, runs on a leaner budget than almost any equivalent live-action production. This cost advantage means that an animated show can remain commercially viable at viewership numbers that would not sustain a live-action equivalent. A drama drawing fewer than 1 million live viewers would be in serious danger of cancellation because the economics of its production would make continuation difficult to justify. Family Guy drawing similar numbers on Wednesday nights can still be justified commercially because its production cost per viewer is much lower than a comparable live-action show, and because the streaming and syndication revenue streams provide a substantial additional income that does not depend on who is watching new episodes live. The syndication situation for Family Guy is extensive and represents significant ongoing revenue. Reruns air on Adult Swim, which returned to carrying the show in 2025 after a previous licensing agreement expired and was subsequently renewed. They air on FXX. They air on Comedy Central under a licensing deal that began in 2024. They air on multiple international channels. The license fees from all of these outlets collectively represent a substantial and reliable income stream that justifies continued production regardless of what is happening with live broadcast ratings on Fox. The streaming situation has become even more significant than syndication. Hulu has been the exclusive streaming home for new Family Guy seasons in the United States, and the show is among the most consistently watched programs in the animated catalog on that platform. The 9.4 million average viewers cited in the 2025 renewal press materials includes streaming viewership, which tells a different and somewhat more favorable story about the show's ongoing relevance than the Wednesday night broadcast numbers alone would suggest. The merchandise universe around Family Guy represents another significant revenue stream that has nothing to do with viewership at all. The characters have been on t-shirts and coffee mugs and phone cases and collectible figures for decades. There have been Family Guy video games. There have been Family Guy-themed events and experiences. The brand has extended well beyond the television show into a broader commercial presence that generates ongoing revenue simply by existing as a recognizable intellectual property. All of these revenue streams taken together explain why Family Guy keeps getting renewed past the point where its live broadcast performance would justify continued production. The decision to continue the show is not primarily a decision about whether the show is still good. It is a decision about whether the commercial infrastructure built around the show continues to generate sufficient revenue to justify the cost of producing new episodes to add to that infrastructure. The answer has remained yes through declining ratings, through creative controversies, through cast changes, through strikes and delays, and public disputes between the creator and the network. The machine keeps running because the economics keep making sense. This is not unique to Family Guy. Many long-running animated shows have stayed on the air well past the peak of their creative vitality because the economic model supports continued production even when the creative rationale has become harder to articulate. The Simpsons has been making this argument for roughly 15 years at this point. The difference is that The Simpsons had a longer run of consistent quality before the decline became visible, and that the show's early seasons remained so culturally significant that there is a stronger argument for the brand's ongoing relevance. Family Guy had a shorter run of peak quality and a faster, more visible decline, which has made the question of why it continues more pointed in some quarters. MacFarlane himself gestured toward this situation in his 2024 anniversary interview when he described the show as having reached escape velocity, meaning it had been going long enough that there was no meaningful distinction between stopping it now and stopping it at any other arbitrary point. This is essentially an acknowledgement that the show no longer has a creative argument for its own continuation, only a commercial one. It continues because the infrastructure continues to generate sufficient revenue. That is a completely honest way to describe the situation. It is also not the same as the show being good. Extended analysis. What American Dad got right that Family Guy got wrong? The comparison between Family Guy and American Dad is one of the most frequently made and most revealing comparisons in the history of American animated television, because the two shows were created by the same person, premiered within months of each other on the same network on the same night, and then diverged in quality in ways that illuminate exactly what went wrong with the older show. American Dad premiered on the 6th of February, 2005, just months before Family Guy's Season 4 return. It was created by Seth MacFarlane along with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman, two writers who had been central to the original Family Guy writing room. The show followed Stan Smith, a patriotic conservative CIA agent in Langley Falls, Virginia, living with his wife Francine, their children Haley and Steve, a space alien named Roger who lived in their attic, and a CIA goldfish named Klaus who was actually a man's brain transplanted into a fish body. The premise was deliberately strange, more aggressively premise-heavy than Family Guy's relatively grounded starting point, and the early reviews were generally lukewarm. Critics saw it as a Family Guy knockoff, a lesser version of the real thing, and many viewers only watched it because it aired right after Family Guy on Sunday nights, rather than because they were specifically seeking it out. The show spent its first couple of seasons finding its feet, leaning too hard on political humor in ways that made it feel one-dimensional. Stan's extreme conservatism drove too much of the comedy in early episodes, and the supporting characters had not yet been fully developed into the specific individuals they would become. American Dad in 2005 was not a better show than Family Guy. It was not as good a show as Family Guy in those early seasons. Then something happened. American Dad got better. Consistently, measurably, clearly better. While Family Guy was going through the changes described throughout this story, the Flanderization of its characters, the cutaway overload, the loss of warmth and heart, the show that everyone had dismissed as a copy was quietly doing the opposite. It was developing its characters. It was finding its identity. It was making choices about what it wanted to be, and then committing to those choices in ways that produced genuine long-term payoffs. The single most important structural difference between the two shows is that American Dad does not use cutaway gags. This decision, whatever its origins, changed everything about how the show had to be written. Without cutaways to fall back on, the writers had to make every episode work as a complete and coherent story. They could not fill time with unrelated gags. They could not use a setup line to jump to a disconnected scene and then back. Every funny moment had to come from the characters and their circumstances. Every joke had to be earned through the plot. This constraint forced the writing staff to become better storytellers, and over time it produced a show that was more consistently satisfying to watch from beginning to end. Roger the Alien became one of the most creative recurring characters in American animation, partly because the writers found a concept for him that was genuinely inexhaustible. Roger could adopt different personas, essentially becoming entirely different characters with different names, different personalities, and different backstories. Each episode could feature a new version of Roger, each one stranger and more elaborate than the last, and the concept never got stale because it was designed to constantly evolve. The audience learned to anticipate Roger's persona reveals as one of the reliable pleasures of each episode, but the specific content of each reveal was unpredictable enough to maintain genuine surprise. Contrast this with what happened to Stewie after the writers decided they had exhausted the evil genius concept. They replaced one highly specific and original character concept with a more generic emotional vulnerability storyline, and then ran that storyline for the remainder of the show's run. The replacement was competent but not original, and the sense of loss was never fully compensated. Stan Smith's arc over the show's run represents a model for how to develop a character in a long-running animated comedy without destroying what made them work in the first place. Stan started as a one-dimensional conservative caricature, and the writers allowed him to grow in ways that complicated the initial characterization without abandoning it. He became someone who was stubborn and often wrong, but who genuinely loved his family and was capable of real change when circumstances demanded it. He made mistakes and sometimes learned from them. He had episodes where he was the hero and episodes where he was the villain, and both felt natural because the character had been built with enough complexity to support both modes. Peter Griffin's arc went in the opposite direction. He started as a lovable fool who meant well and became a character who seemed to enjoy causing harm. The specific qualities that made early Peter likable, his genuine love for his family, his willingness to admit he was wrong, his moments of unexpected competence, were systematically stripped away over the seasons, leaving behind something that was harder to root for and easier to find simply unpleasant. Francine Smith maintained enough consistency over the show's run to remain a sympathetic and interesting character. Haley and Steve were given space to develop as individuals with their own arcs and relationship to the world. Klaus the goldfish occupied a specific role as the household's punching bag, but one that was built into the character from the beginning, rather than assigned to a character who had originally been something else. Meg Griffin was turned into a punching bag after she had been established as a different kind of character, which is a fundamentally different and more uncomfortable situation. The warmth that Family Guy lost after its early seasons is something American Dad maintained throughout its entire run. The Smith family fights and schemes against each other and gets into elaborate disasters, but underneath all of it there is a genuine love between them that the show never abandoned. Stan loves Francine in ways that the show finds opportunities to demonstrate even in episodes where his more absurd qualities are driving the plot. The children, despite their complicated relationship with Stan's worldview, are clearly part of a family that functions as a family rather than as a collection of individuals who happen to share a house. When American Dad eventually moved from Fox to TBS after its 11th season, a transition that could have killed a lesser show, it continued to produce quality episodes on a new network with a slightly different audience profile. The show adapted. The writing staff maintained the creative standards they had built. The characters remained recognizable as themselves. The warmth persisted. The American Dad comparison matters for the Family Guy story because it eliminates the most common excuse offered for the older show's decline. The usual argument is that any show will deteriorate after 20-plus years, that creative fatigue is inevitable, that no comedy can stay fresh indefinitely. And there is some truth to this as a general principle. Long-running shows face real challenges in maintaining quality over time. But American Dad has been running for approximately the same amount of time as Family Guy and has not suffered the same catastrophic creative decline. The comparison proves that longevity alone does not doom a show. What dooms a show is the specific choices made along the way. Family Guy made different choices from American Dad, and the results were correspondingly different. Extended analysis. The legacy question and what Family Guy actually changed. Separate from the question of whether the current seasons justify the show's continued existence, there is a genuinely interesting question about what Family Guy's actual legacy in American entertainment is, what it changed, what it made possible, and what impression it will leave when viewed from a distance of 50 years rather than from the middle of its ongoing run. The show's contribution to the format of animated comedy is real and significant. Before Family Guy, the dominant model for primetime animated comedy was The Simpsons model, which was essentially a sophisticated family sitcom with enhanced freedom to use visual comedy and more extensive pop culture references. The Simpsons had expanded what animated comedy could be, but it had done so within a recognizable structure. Family Guy's addition of the cutaway gag as a central structural element, whatever the later problems with that element, genuinely changed the vocabulary of animated comedy. It created a new kind of comedic rhythm, a way of layering reference and allusion on top of story that influenced not just animated shows but certain kinds of live-action comedy as well. The show's proof of concept around the Adult Swim revival changed how the industry thought about what a canceled show was worth. Before Family Guy, the conventional wisdom was that cancellation was essentially permanent, that the audience for a canceled show dispersed and could not be reassembled. Family Guy's Adult Swim ratings and DVD sales demonstrated that an audience could remain loyal to a canceled show through alternative forms of access and could be reconstituted when the original show returned. This proof of concept contributed to a broader willingness in the industry to revive canceled shows, to give canceled properties second chances on streaming platforms and cable networks, to treat cancellation as a pause rather than an ending. The show's role in establishing the cultural conversation around adult animated comedy in the 2000s is also significant. Family Guy, South Park and The Simpsons together defined what animated comedy for adults meant during a period when the form was establishing itself as a serious and commercially significant part of the television landscape. Each show had a distinct sensibility and a distinct relationship to its subject matter, and the arguments between them and about them helped clarify what the form was capable of and what it owed to its audience. The specific comedic sensibility that Family Guy established in its peak years, irreverent and referential, and willing to go to places that other comedies would not go, influenced a generation of comedy writers who grew up watching those early seasons and who carried the show's approach to humor with them into their own work. The cutaway gag format has appeared in various forms in live-action comedies, in YouTube content, in social media humor. The specific rhythm of the setup to cutaway to return that Family Guy popularized became one of the templates for a certain kind of internet humor that proliferates today. The show also contributed, through its controversies and the public debates they generated, to broader conversations about what comedy is allowed to do and who it is allowed to target. The PTC complaints and FCC battles and the public arguments about specific episodes were not simply friction in the show's commercial history. They were part of a larger cultural negotiation about the limits of comedic expression on broadcast television, a negotiation that played out in public and that shaped the regulatory and social environment in which subsequent comedies operated. These are real contributions that deserve acknowledgement when assessing what the show actually was rather than simply what it became. The scandals are real. The creative decline is real. The controversies are real, and some of them involved genuine harm. All of those things are true, and they exist alongside the fact that the show, at its best, was doing something genuinely original and genuinely funny, and that it changed things in ways that mattered. The tragedy of Family Guy is not that it failed. The show that exists today in its 24th season, watched by a fraction of its peak audience on a Wednesday night, is by conventional measures a success. It is still on the air. It is still generating revenue. It is still being renewed. The tragedy of Family Guy is that it had more to offer than it gave, that the creative potential that produced those first 3 seasons was sufficient to sustain something more interesting and more lasting than what the show eventually settled into, and that the combination of institutional decisions and creative choices and economic pressures gradually reduced it from the thing it was to the thing it became. The early episodes are still there, available on streaming, still funny in ways that reward careful attention. They represent what the show was when it was being made by someone who cared about getting it right, who had something specific to say and was excited about saying it. That version of the show is part of television history now, and that part of its history is worth preserving in memory alongside the more complicated later chapters. Extended analysis, the franchise future and what comes next. With the 4-season renewal through 2028 and the spin-off Stewie ordered for the 2027 to 2028 season, Family Guy is entering a new phase of its existence, one that is less about the question of whether it will continue and more about the question of what form that continuation will take and what relationship it will have to the show's original identity. The Stewie spin-off is the most significant new development in the Family Guy universe. A spin-off based on a single character from the main show is a well-established format in American television, and the Cleveland show established that Family Guy specifically could support a character-based spin-off, even if that show's commercial performance was ultimately mixed. The Cleveland show ran for 4 seasons from 2009 to 2013 before being canceled. A reasonable run, but not the breakout success that would have established the spin-off as a permanent parallel franchise. Stewie as a spin-off character presents both opportunities and challenges that are different from what Cleveland's spin-off faced. On the opportunity side, Stewie is more central to Family Guy's identity than Cleveland ever was, a character who has been one of the show's most popular and widely recognized creations for 25 years. The character has a following that extends well beyond the Family Guy audience, showing up in popular culture references and internet humor in ways that Cleveland never achieved. On the challenge side, the Stewie who would anchor a spin-off in 2027 is not the Stewie who made the character famous. The evil genius baby who built laser weapons and plotted world domination has been replaced by a softer, more emotionally accessible character whose storylines center on his relationship with Brian, his personal identity, and his emotional vulnerability. That character can be entertaining and has produced genuine highlights in the main show. Whether it can carry an entire separate series is a genuinely open question. The timing of the spin-off order, with the main show already renewed through its 27th season, means that Family Guy will be producing two concurrent animated series based in the same fictional universe for several years. This raises questions about resource allocation and creative focus that the show has not previously had to navigate. When does the main show reference the spin-off? When do the characters exist in the same space? What happens to Brian's relationship with Stewie if Stewie is now primarily living in a separate narrative? These are production questions that will be answered in the rooms where these shows are actually made. The more interesting question from a storytelling perspective is what a Stewie-focused spin-off will actually be about, what its emotional center will be, what it will be trying to say. The original Stewie had an extremely clear purpose. He was the most concentrated expression of the show's willingness to commit to an absurd premise entirely and without apology, a baby who was genuinely trying to take over the world. The comedy came from the absolute commitment to the premise. What is the equivalent commitment in the spin-off? The streaming strategy around the franchise is also evolving in ways that suggest a deliberate effort to adapt the brand to the way contemporary audiences actually consume content. The Hulu-exclusive holiday specials were a first step toward producing Family Guy content specifically for streaming platforms, rather than for broadcast. The eventual merger of Hulu and Disney Plus will consolidate the entire library in a single destination, making the franchise more accessible to new audiences who might discover it through browsing rather than through scheduled broadcast viewing. This accessibility to new audiences is itself a double-edged thing. New viewers discovering the show through streaming may come to it without the context of when different seasons were made and what the show was trying to do at different points in its history. They may encounter a season from 2010, followed by a season from 2023, without any sense of the narrative arc between them, or the ways in which the show changed over that time. For the original audience, that arc is part of the show's meaning. The early seasons are more meaningful because of what they were before the decline. For a new audience discovering the entire library simultaneously, the picture may look different. The question of what Family Guy will be when it reaches its 30th anniversary in 2029 is genuinely interesting and genuinely uncertain. The show has survived everything that should have ended it: 2 cancellations, a creator's strike, the loss of its creator's active creative involvement, declining broadcast ratings, multiple controversies that generated national coverage, and the simple passage of time through cultural moments that have changed the conversation around virtually everything it does. It has survived all of this and will apparently keep surviving for several more years. What it will survive as is the open question. Whether the version of the show that reaches its 30th anniversary will have found a way to reconnect with the creative vitality that made the original seasons worth watching, or whether it will simply have continued to exist past all reasonable expectation through the force of institutional momentum and commercial logic, is something that neither the show's fans nor its critics can answer in advance. The honest assessment at this moment is that the evidence from the last 15 seasons does not strongly suggest the former. The economics of the situation guarantee the latter. The machine keeps running. The archive keeps generating revenue. The manatees, metaphorically speaking, keep picking up their balls and feeding them into the machine. And somewhere in that archive, in those first 3 seasons and the best episodes of the revival, is the show that all of these years of controversy and decline and renewal and institutional decision-making were originally supposed to be about. A genuinely funny, genuinely warm, genuinely original animated comedy about a dysfunctional family in a fictional Rhode Island town, made by someone who cared about getting it right, who had stayed up for 6 months drawing in his kitchen because he had something he needed to show the world. That show is still there. It will always be there. The scandals are real, and the decline is real, and the business decisions are what they are. But the original thing remains, available on any streaming platform on any given night, as evidence of what it was when it was still very much alive. If you have been here for all of this, through every section and every extended analysis, thank you for real. This has been a long journey through 25+ years of one of television's most complicated stories. If it helped you find some rest tonight, please leave a like, drop a comment with where in the world you are watching from, and what time it is, and subscribe if you want more of this kind of deep dive into television history. Sleep well, wherever you are. Deep Dive. Seth MacFarlane, the man behind the machine. To understand Family Guy fully, you have to understand Seth MacFarlane, not as a celebrity or a brand, but as a specific kind of creative person operating in a specific kind of industry. MacFarlane was, at the moment of Family Guy's creation, a young animator with a very particular set of influences and a very particular set of ambitions, and the show that emerged from that combination of influences and ambitions reflected those origins so clearly that the show's subsequent changes can almost be mapped onto the changes in MacFarlane's own professional circumstances. MacFarlane grew up in Kent, Connecticut, where he was drawing cartoons from the time he was very young. He was passionate about old Hollywood, about the big band era, about classic films, and the comedians and performers of mid-century American entertainment. When he studied at Rhode Island School of Design, he was training not just in the technical skills of animation, but in the aesthetic traditions of an entire era of American entertainment that predated his birth by decades. This sensibility, deeply nostalgic in a very specific way, shows up throughout the early seasons of Family Guy in the specific pop culture references the show chose to make, in the kinds of musical numbers it included, in the particular flavor of comedy that felt simultaneously contemporary and slightly old-fashioned. The influence of classic Hollywood comedy is visible in the structure of the original cutaway gags. The best of them have the rhythm and construction of old-school comedic bits, the kind that were crafted by writers who took comedy seriously as a craft. There is a precision to the early cutaways, a sense that someone thought carefully about where the joke was, when to cut in, and where to cut out, that reflects an aesthetic sensibility shaped by watching a lot of comedy that was made by people who thought about these things. MacFarlane's voice work on the show is also relevant to understanding what the show originally was. He voiced 4 of the most important characters: Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, and each of those vocal performances was a distinct and considered character. The voice he developed for Stewie, a kind of patrician British villainy applied to an infant, was genuinely strange and brilliant. The voice for Brian was warm and wry in specific ways that communicated character beyond just the lines he was delivering. Even Peter's broad working-class delivery had specific qualities that made him more than a generic cartoon father. These were performances from someone who cared about character, and they gave the show a vocal texture that subsequent vocal performances could not fully replicate in the character's most hollow later incarnations. MacFarlane's ambition to be taken seriously as an entertainer beyond animation was always present and was not something that appeared suddenly after Family Guy became successful. He had always seen himself as a multi-hyphenate talent in the classic Hollywood mold: a singer, a writer, a performer, a director. The TED films, the Orville, the jazz album recordings, the Oscar hosting, the classical music concert tours he has done, all of these are expressions of the same desire to be a serious entertainer, rather than simply the guy who made that cartoon. This is a legitimate ambition, and the specific things he did with it were often good. But it meant that Family Guy was always going to be one part of a larger portfolio rather than the singular creative focus of someone who had made it the center of their professional life. The comparison to a creator like Matt Groening is instructive here. Groening created The Simpsons and has remained closely associated with it even as the show has changed over the decades. He has other projects and interests, but his public identity remains substantially tied to the Simpsons franchise in ways that create both commercial incentive and something that functions like ongoing responsibility for what the show is. MacFarlane's relationship to Family Guy became something different as the years went on, more like an executive producer's relationship to a property he once created than a creator's ongoing relationship to a living creative work. MacFarlane has talked about Family Guy in ways that are refreshingly honest for a creator discussing his most famous work. He has acknowledged that the show has been running too long in his own estimation. He has acknowledged that he stepped back from the creative work. He has acknowledged that the relationship with Fox is complicated in ways that go beyond normal creator-network tension. This honesty is admirable and genuinely unusual. Many creators of long-running shows maintain an official position of enthusiasm and engagement that does not match their actual level of involvement. MacFarlane does not particularly do this, and the result is a public record of what the show actually is from the person who built it that is more candid than most of its genre. What that candor reveals is that Family Guy, as it currently exists, is a show that its creator considers valuable primarily as a financial instrument that generates revenue supporting causes he cares about, As an artifact of his past that people still enjoy, and as a franchise with commercial momentum that does not have a compelling reason to stop. This is a perfectly respectable relationship to have with one's old work. It is just not the relationship of a creator actively driving a creative project towards something they urgently want it to be. And the difference between those two relationships shows up in the work. Deep Dive, the show's relationship to religion, race, and sensitive categories. Family Guy's approach to sensitive categories of humor has been one of the most consistently analyzed and debated aspects of its content throughout its entire run. The show has always engaged with religion, race, disability, sexuality, gender, and other areas where comedy can easily veer from satire into something less defensible, and its track record in these areas is genuinely mixed in ways that deserve more nuanced treatment than either its defenders or its critics typically provide. In the original seasons, the show's engagement with these categories tended to be pointed in a specific direction. When it made jokes about religion, it was generally satirizing a certain kind of smug or hypocritical religiosity rather than faith itself. When it engaged with racial material, it was often trying to expose the absurdity of racist attitudes by foregrounding them in a way that made the holder look foolish. The humor was doing something. It had a direction. The episode Holy Crap from the first season, in which Peter's deeply conservative Catholic father comes to visit and his extreme piety creates chaos, is a good example of how the show handled religion in those early years. The comedy came from the specific texture of that kind of faith, from the rigidity and the refusal to engage with anything that might complicate the worldview, from the way that kind of certainty affects everyone around it. The episode was not anti-religion in a simple sense. It was specifically about a particular kind of religious expression and what that expression does to family dynamics. Compare that to the later seasons, where religious jokes often appeared as simple attacks without the specificity or the directional clarity. The show would make a joke about a religious figure or institution in a way that seemed designed primarily to generate objection rather than to say something about the thing being referenced. The early seasons used offense in service of a point. The later seasons sometimes used offense as the point itself. The show's engagement with race is particularly complicated when examined across its entire run. The early seasons included racial humor that was generally trying to expose the absurdity of prejudice by satirizing the prejudice holder. Peter's various misadventures involving misunderstandings of racial dynamics were generally structured so that Peter was the fool, his ignorance was the joke, and the audience was positioned to see the humor in the gap between his limited understanding and reality. In the later seasons, this directionality became less consistent. Jokes about racial groups sometimes appeared without the satirical framing that had contextualized the earlier material, without the clear signal about what position the show was taking relative to the content it was presenting. The material became more prone to simply presenting a stereotype and expecting the audience to find it funny rather than to use the stereotype as a tool for making a larger comedic or satirical point. The disability humor in the show evolved in similarly complicated ways. Joe Swanson's character, introduced in Season 1, was originally written as a demonstration that Peter's assumptions about disability were limited and wrong. Joe was tough, capable, admired, successful. Peter was jealous of him. The comedy in Joe's introduction came from the gap between what Peter expected and what he found, from the way Joe's reality exceeded the limited frame Peter had for thinking about disability. In the later seasons, Joe's disability became increasingly a source of jokes about limitation, rather than a characteristic of a full character who happened to use a wheelchair. His wife Bonnie fell out of love with him. His friends mocked him. The capable and admired figure of the early seasons was replaced by someone who was more often the butt of jokes about his disability than someone who transcended those jokes. This is a genuine regression in how the show handled the character, and it reflects the broader pattern of the show, taking what was complex and making it simpler and less sympathetic over time. The show's engagement with LGBTQ representation has its own complicated history. Stewie's sexuality became an increasingly prominent element of his characterization in the later seasons, though the show consistently declined to make his sexuality explicit or to treat it as a resolved aspect of his identity. The jokes around Stewie's gender expression and apparent same-sex attraction multiplied substantially across the show's middle and later years, to the point where they became one of the most frequent categories of humor associated with the character. For some viewers, this representation, however coded, felt like acknowledgement of an underrepresented experience. For others, the use of LGBTQ elements primarily as a source of jokes rather than as substantive characterization felt reductive rather than progressive. The episode Family Gay from Season 7, in which Peter is accidentally given a gay gene by a doctor and temporarily becomes gay, generated substantial criticism from LGBTQ advocacy organizations who felt the episode treated homosexuality as a condition to be joked about rather than as a genuine aspect of human experience. The show's approach to the topic, played entirely for laughs without apparent engagement with what the experience actually involves, was, for many viewers, a good example of the later season's habit of addressing sensitive subjects without the care or the directional clarity that had made the original season's approach to sensitive material more defensible. These failures and successes across different categories of sensitive humor are not evenly distributed across the show's run. The early seasons did things better than the later seasons, generally and specifically. The later seasons did things that were harder to defend. The progression is real and visible when you examine the specific episodes across different eras of the show's history. Deep Dive, the 9/11 connection and comedy in the wake of disaster. There is a specific piece of Family Guy history that most people who discuss the show's controversies overlook, partly because it predates most of the episodes that are usually referenced, and partly because its implications are complicated. In the year following the 11th of September 2001 attacks, Family Guy was already in the middle of its third season, and the production of that season was affected by the attacks in ways that left specific marks on what aired and what did not. The show's third season had been in production before the attacks occurred, and some of the material that had been written and recorded before September 11th suddenly existed in a very different cultural context afterward. The episode Road to Rhode Island, which had originally aired in May of 2000, included a scene in which Stewie sings a song and distracts airport security from noticing weapons in his luggage, followed by a quip involving Osama bin Laden. The scene was cut from reruns of the episode following the attacks and was removed from the Season 1 DVD release. This was an early and relatively uncontroversial instance of the show, responding to the changed cultural context by removing content that had been acceptable before September 11th and was no longer appropriate after. More broadly, the attacks created a climate in American entertainment that affected how certain kinds of comedy could be received. The kind of irreverence that Family Guy had built its identity on, the willingness to go places other shows would not go, to make light of things other shows treated as untouchable, required a certain social permission that the attacks temporarily revoked. There was a period in late 2001 and through 2002 when American entertainment culture was less willing to tolerate the kind of aggressive comedy that the show traded in, and this was part of the context in which Fox made the decision to cancel the show for the second time. The show's cancellation and the Adult Swim revival happened during a period when the country was still processing September 11th and its aftermath, and by the time the show returned in 2005, the cultural context had shifted again. The initial period of solemn reflection had given way to a more contentious political environment in which the Iraq War and the Bush administration were generating significant public anger on one side and significant defensive nationalism on the other. The revived Family Guy, with its explicit liberal political sympathies and its willingness to criticize the administration and the war, was entering a charged environment that gave its political humor a specific edge that the original seasons had not had. This political edge became more pronounced through the Brian character, whose liberal political views and atheism became a more prominent part of his characterization in the revival seasons. The show used Brian as a vehicle for expressing political positions that aligned with McFarlane's own views, which was consistent with the long tradition of animated comedy being used to say things that live-action shows could not easily say. But the degree to which Brian became a mouthpiece rather than a character was a specific failure of the revival period, one that the most engaged fans noticed and commented on repeatedly. The 420 episode from Season 7, in which Brian leads a campaign to legalize marijuana in the show's fictional town, generated real-world controversy when the Venezuelan government responded to it by banning Family Guy from broadcast in that country. Venezuela's justice minister cited the episode as an example of the United States promoting drug use to young people, and cable stations were warned they could face fines for continuing to air the show. Whatever one thinks of the episode's actual content, the fact that a comedic animated show was generating official government responses from another country illustrated the degree to which Family Guy had become a cultural export with real political valence beyond the United States. The intersection of comedy and political and social sensitivity was a recurring issue for the show throughout its run, and the ways in which it navigated or failed to navigate that intersection changed significantly across different eras. The early seasons had found a way to be genuinely transgressive while also saying something, to use offense in service of a point that justified the offense. The later seasons more often used offense as an end in itself, which is a different and harder to defend approach. Deep Dive. The ratings history in full detail. The full ratings history of Family Guy, examined carefully, tells a more nuanced story than the simple narrative of decline might suggest. The decline is real and substantial, but the specific shape of it reveals something about how the show found different audiences at different points in its history. The debut episode on the 31st of January 1999 drew approximately 22 million viewers. This number is inflated by the Super Bowl lead-out effect and should not be taken as a baseline. The organic audience for the first season, after the Super Bowl novelty wore off, settled at around 12.8 million households per episode, which ranked the show 33rd in the overall Nielsen ratings. For context, this placed it ahead of many established programs and was genuinely strong performance for a new animated show from an unknown creator. The second season's move to Thursday nights against Frasier saw ratings drop to around 8 to 9 million viewers per episode in the slots where the show actually aired, with irregular scheduling making a precise average difficult to calculate. The Tuesday night slot that followed faced Who Wants to Be a Millionaire at peak phenomenon status and saw ratings fall further. The third season, back on Thursday nights, averaged around 6 to 7 million viewers before being pulled. The final episodes of the season, once Fox began scheduling irregularly again, dropped toward 4 to 5 million. The cancellation followed. The Adult Swim reruns never generated traditional ratings in the way that broadcast numbers do, because cable viewership was measured differently and the late-night demographic was not the primary target of Nielsen's household measurement system. But the network's internal data showed the show regularly drawing 2 to 3 million viewers per episode in its late-night slot, which was enormous for that time period on that block and represented a fundamental proof of the audience's continued existence. The Season 4 return in May of 2005 drew 11.85 million viewers for the premiere, then settled into an average of around 7.9 million for the full season. The show had essentially recovered its pre-cancellation audience and done so in a dramatically favorable Sunday night time slot. This was the peak of the revived show's broadcast performance. From that peak in 2005, the decline was consistent across virtually every subsequent season. Season 5 averaged around 7.1 million, Season 6 around 6.5 million. By the time the show was in its 8th and 9th seasons, averages were in the 5 to 6 million range. By the 12th and 13th seasons, averages had fallen to around 4 to 5 million. By the 17th and 18th seasons, the show was drawing around 2 million viewers per episode. By the 20th season, the average had dropped below 2 million. By the 23rd season, live broadcast viewership had fallen to approximately 723,000 viewers per episode. The move from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights in 2023 was both a symptom and a cause of continued decline. It was a symptom because it reflected Fox's reduced confidence in the show as a Sunday anchor, their willingness to move it off prime scheduling real estate in favor of shows they considered stronger prospects. And it was a cause because Wednesday nights attract fundamentally different audiences and levels of appointment viewing than Sunday nights, which meant the show's remaining appointment viewers would need to make an active effort to find it in its new slot. The streaming numbers tell a different story. Hulu's data, as reported in the 2025 renewal announcement, showed an average of 9.4 million viewers per episode across all platforms when streaming viewership was included. This represents the show's actual audience in the contemporary television environment, an audience that watches on its own schedule rather than at a designated broadcast time. The gap between the live broadcast number and the total platform number illustrates something important about how television consumption has changed and why traditional broadcast ratings alone are no longer an accurate measure of a show's actual reach. The business implication of this gap is that Family Guy has successfully transitioned from a broadcast-first property to a streaming-first one, even while continuing to produce new content for broadcast. The new episodes serve primarily as additions to the streaming library, giving subscribers of Hulu new reasons to engage with the show and adding to the archive that attracts ongoing viewership regardless of when specific episodes were produced. The broadcast airing is increasingly a secondary function rather than the primary one. This transition is not unique to Family Guy. Many long-running broadcast shows have seen their live viewership decline substantially while their streaming presence grew, as the audience that once watched appointment television at specific times shifted to watching on their own schedule through streaming platforms. What is somewhat unusual about Family Guy is the degree to which its streaming value is concentrated in older content rather than newer content, the archive effect being more pronounced than for most comparable shows. The practical implication of all this for the show's creative decisions is interesting and somewhat paradoxical. If the primary commercial value of Family Guy is the archive, and if the archive's value derives primarily from the early seasons that remain widely watched and enjoyed, then the continued production of new episodes matters less for its direct contribution to the product being sold and more for its function in maintaining the brand as an active entity. A show that is still producing new episodes is a franchise. A show that stopped producing new episodes is a catalog. Franchises attract different kinds of attention and commercial interest than catalogs, even when the catalog is the thing most people are actually consuming. This reframing helps explain why the renewal makes commercial sense even when the creative case for it is difficult to articulate. Family Guy the franchise has value that Family Guy the current creative project might not independently justify. Keeping the show in production, even at reduced episode counts per season and even on a secondary broadcast night, maintains the franchise status that keeps the brand commercially active. The economics of animated production make this maintenance affordable enough that the marginal cost of continuing is lower than the marginal value of maintaining active franchise status. Deep Dive: The Writing Room and the People Who Made the Show. The specific people in the Family Guy writing room at different points in its history had more influence on the show's character than any formal decision about the show's direction or any institutional policy about what the show should be. Understanding who was in those rooms and what they brought to the work illuminates much of what changed across the show's arc in ways that high-level analysis cannot fully capture. The original writing team that MacFarlane assembled for the first 3 seasons included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. This group had a specific collective sensibility, a shared sense of what the show was trying to do and what kind of humor it was built on. They had worked together through the process of figuring out what Family Guy was, of establishing the characters' voices, of finding the show's specific comedic register. They had the institutional knowledge that comes from building something from the ground up. When the show was canceled and the writing staff dispersed, that institutional knowledge went with them. Some of these writers ended up on other shows and carried their Family Guy sensibility into new contexts. Goldman and Donovan went to Scrubs, where their specific kind of comedy influenced a show with very different structural priorities. Barker and Weitzman helped create American Dad, where some of what they had learned about character and tone from the original Family Guy seasons was applied in a context with different rules and different constraints. When the show returned in 2005 and needed to rebuild its writing room, some of the original writers came back and new writers joined. The reconstruction was never quite the same as the original configuration, because the specific combination of people that had worked in those original years was not reproducible. The writers who came back brought their own experience from the intervening years. The new writers brought their own sensibilities. The show's character in the revival seasons reflected this mixed lineage, incorporating elements of the original approach while also moving in directions the original team might not have taken. David Goodman joined the show as co-executive producer in the 3rd season and eventually became executive producer, serving in that role through a substantial portion of the show's run. Goodman's influence on the show during his tenure was significant. He was the public voice defending the show against PTC complaints and FCC pressure, and his understanding of how to navigate the relationship between the show's content and its regulatory environment was sophisticated in ways that kept the show on the air through challenges that might have ended it. Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin became the showrunners as MacFarlane stepped back from active creative involvement, and they have managed the show's day-to-day creative direction through the majority of its current run. Sulkin was himself at the center of a specific controversy in 2011 when tweets he had posted in 2009 came to light, tweets that many people found deeply offensive in their content. Sulkin apologized for the tweets and continued in his role at the show. The incident was a specific example of the kinds of controversies that the show's personnel, not just the show's content, could generate. The writing rooms of the later seasons were generally larger than the original room and included more writers rotating through shorter stints, which is a common structural feature of long-running television productions. This structure can produce inconsistency in the voice and sensibility of individual episodes because different writers bring different approaches, and the larger room means that each individual writer has less influence on any given episode's specific character. The original seasons, written by a smaller and more cohesive group, had a consistency of voice that reflected that cohesion. The later seasons were more variable, capable of genuine highlights when the right combination of writers was working on the right material, and more prone to the kind of empty or mean-spirited content that characterized the show's most criticized periods. The addition of more women to the writing staff in later seasons, credited by some observers with the improvement in how Meg and other female characters were handled, represents a specific instance of personnel changes producing visible content changes. When the people making decisions about what jokes to make and what stories to tell become more diverse in their backgrounds and perspectives, the kinds of jokes that get made and the stories that get told change accordingly. This is not a guarantee of improvement, but in Family Guy's case, the correlation between the addition of more women writers and the improvement in the show's handling of its female characters appears to be genuinely causal rather than merely coincidental. The story of who worked on Family Guy across its entire run is, in microcosm, the story of American comedy writing over 25 years, of how the profession changed and how the kinds of people who entered it changed, and how those changes eventually showed up in the content being produced. The show is a historical document of those changes as much as it is a creative artifact. If you have stayed with this all the way through to the very end, you have been on a genuinely long journey through the history of one of television's most complicated creative stories. Thank you for the company. If you found it useful or relaxing or both, please leave a like and a comment with where in the world you are watching from tonight. And subscribe if you want more of this kind of thing. Sleep well. Deep Dive: The Humor Philosophy and Why It Matters. Comedy is not a neutral medium. Every comedy show makes choices about what it considers funny, who it considers the appropriate target of humor, and what relationship it has to the people and ideas it jokes about. These choices are philosophical as much as they are aesthetic, and analyzing them carefully reveals something about the worldview embedded in the show's specific approach to making people laugh. The humor philosophy of the original Family Guy seasons was built on a specific kind of absurdism that was also fundamentally optimistic. The show was willing to go to dark places, to make jokes about death and violence and failure and social dysfunction, but it did so from a perspective that ultimately believed in the value of the people it was watching. Peter Griffin making terrible decisions was funny because Peter was essentially a good person who happened to be profoundly unequipped for the decisions he was making. The show liked Peter even when it was laughing at him, and that affection was transmitted to the audience in ways that made the laughter feel generous rather than contemptuous. This is a meaningful distinction. There is humor that laughs with its subjects and humor that laughs at them, and the difference between the two modes produces a completely different audience experience. When you laugh with someone, you feel connected to them. When you laugh at someone, you feel superior to them. Both kinds of laughter exist and both can be funny, but they produce different effects over time, and a show that relies primarily on the second kind eventually becomes uncomfortable to spend time with. The original Family Guy seasons mixed both kinds of humor, with the balance favoring the first. When Peter did something foolish, the show was laughing with him in a sense, inviting the audience to recognize something familiar in his foolishness even as they recognized how foolish it was. When the show satirized something, The joke was usually at the expense of an institution or an attitude rather than simply at the expense of a person's existence. The later seasons shifted this balance substantially. The humor became more contemptuous, more interested in laughing at people rather than with them. The treatment of Meg was the most extreme example, but the same dynamic showed up in how the show handled Joe's disability, in how it deployed certain recurring characters, in the specific flavor of physical comedy that became more graphic and more interested in depicting suffering than in using physical comedy as an expression of cartoon absurdism. The shift from dark humor to shock value is related to this shift in the humor philosophy's underlying orientation. Dark humor, at its best, uses the uncomfortable and the taboo to reveal something true about human experience, to find the comedy in situations that are genuinely difficult or frightening, because recognizing their difficulty in a comedic frame is a way of asserting some control over them. This is what the original Family Guy was doing at its best. The show about a baby who was plotting his mother's murder was funny partly because it was genuinely absurd and partly because it was finding something in the relationship between parents and infants, in the total dependence and total vulnerability of that relationship, that was genuinely strange and slightly unsettling. Shock value, by contrast, simply presents extreme content and expects the extremeness itself to generate a reaction. The reaction may be laughter, or it may be discomfort, or it may be a combination, but the shock is doing all the work rather than the comedy. When the work of generating the audience's reaction is entirely carried by the shock, the comedy has given up on its obligations. A comedic shock that does not also say something is not really doing comedy. It is doing spectacle. The best comedy, and the best of the original Family Guy seasons fall into this category, says something through the shock. It uses the transgression of audience expectations to make a point that the transgression itself helps deliver. The Stewie killing Lois premise was shocking, yes, but the shock was in service of something genuinely comedic: the absurdity of taking seriously a baby's fantasies of matricide, the specific strangeness of a creature who cannot yet walk unaided, but who speaks like a Bond villain and builds weapons in his bedroom. The shock and the comedy were integrated. In the later seasons, the shock and the comedy decoupled. The graphic violence became more realistic and more detailed in ways that pushed toward actual discomfort rather than cartoon absurdism. The adult themes were handled more bluntly and less cleverly. The transgression was increasingly the point rather than the delivery mechanism for a point. And when transgression is the point, you have no place to go except toward more extreme transgression, which is a cycle with no satisfying endpoint. Understanding this shift in the humor philosophy is important for understanding why viewers who had loved the early seasons found themselves uncomfortable with the later ones, even when they could not articulate exactly what had changed. The change was real and it was philosophical, not just aesthetic. The show's underlying relationship to its audience and to the people it depicted had shifted in ways that made spending time with it a different kind of experience. Deep Dive: The Internet Age and How It Changed Family Guy's Identity. Family Guy's relationship to the internet is one of the more interesting aspects of its cultural history because the show's survival and revival were substantially enabled by internet-era developments in media consumption, and the show's later identity as primarily a clip culture phenomenon reflects the degree to which it adapted to and was shaped by the internet's particular demands on entertainment. The Adult Swim reruns that saved the show in 2003 were themselves a form of what would later be called binge-watching, an audience consuming an entire back catalog of a show in a dedicated viewing session rather than following it episodically in its original broadcast form. The people who watched Family Guy on Adult Swim in 2003 and 2004 were not following a scheduled program. They were discovering a complete archive of episodes and watching them in whatever order and quantity suited them. This is a mode of television consumption that the internet would eventually make universal, but that Adult Swim enabled specifically for Family Guy at a critical moment. The DVD release in 2003 extended this logic further. Buying a television show on DVD was an assertion that the show was worth owning as a permanent object, rather than simply watching and forgetting. The people who bought the Family Guy DVD sets in 2003 and 2004 were making an active investment in the show's preservation and continued relevance. They were also, by sharing those DVDs and discussing them with friends, functioning as a kind of informal distribution network for a show that had no official broadcast presence during that period. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned to broadcast. The timing was almost perfectly aligned with what the show had become by the time of its revival, a show whose primary comedic unit was the short self-contained cutaway gag rather than the complete episode. Cutaway gags, it turned out, were ideal YouTube content. They were short, they were self-explanatory, they required no context from the surrounding episode to understand, and the funniest ones were genuinely funny in the way that earned views and shares. Family Guy became one of the most viral shows on the early internet, specifically because of how well its cutaway format mapped onto the YouTube clip culture that was developing simultaneously. This viral clip identity shaped the show's later seasons in ways that were not always healthy for it as a piece of storytelling. Once the show had discovered that individual cutaways were its most shareable and most widely distributed content, there was an incentive to produce more of them, to make them longer so they could stand alone more completely, to invest more creative energy in individual gags and less in the episodic stories that connected them. The show's identity gradually migrated from a sitcom with cutaways to something closer to a comedy sketch show with a thin sitcom frame, and this migration was driven, at least in part, by the alignment between the cutaway format and what internet distribution rewarded. The memes that emerged from Family Guy in the mid to late 2000s further cemented this transformation. Specific frames from specific cutaways became reaction images. Specific lines became catchphrases that circulated independently of their original context. The show became, for a generation of internet users, something they experienced primarily as disconnected fragments rather than as complete episodes. This fragmented experience of the show was not a misrepresentation of what the show had become. The show itself had come to function primarily as a generator of fragments, of individual moments, rather than of complete narratives. The consequences of this internet-era identity for the show's quality are mixed. The viral cut format produced some genuinely brilliant individual moments that stand alone beautifully as short comedy pieces. The commitment to generating shareable content kept the show culturally relevant in the social media era in ways that more conventionally structured comedies struggled to achieve. But it also accelerated the decoupling of individual gags from narrative context that had been identified as a problem since the early revival seasons, and it created a feedback loop in which the show was rewarded for doing the thing its critics said was its central failure. The show's current streaming existence is in some ways the natural endpoint of this evolution. A streaming audience consuming Family Guy is experiencing it in the fragmented, non-linear, self-directed way that internet consumption encourages, watching individual episodes or sections of episodes rather than following the show sequentially. For such an audience, the original argument for Family Guy, that it told interesting stories about a funny family, is less important than the argument for it as a generator of funny individual moments. And the show, over the course of its history, has progressively become better suited to that second argument than to the first. This is not necessarily a criticism. Television and humor both evolve, and the ways in which audiences consume entertainment have changed genuinely and significantly over the course of Family Guy's run. A show that adapts to those changes rather than resisting them may be doing something pragmatically intelligent, even if the adaptation costs it something in terms of its original identity. But the adaptation does cost it something, and that cost is worth naming clearly even when the strategic logic of the adaptation makes sense. Deep dive. The cultural conversation Family Guy generated. Beyond the specific controversies detailed in the main sections of this story, Family Guy contributed to several broader cultural conversations that are worth acknowledging when assessing its full legacy. The show was not simply a passive target of cultural criticism. It actively generated discussions about comedy, representation, censorship, and the relationship between entertainment and social values that had real effects beyond the show itself. The debate that Family Guy provoked about animated television as a form suitable for adult audiences was part of a broader expansion of what primetime animation was understood to be able to do. When Family Guy premiered in 1999, the established model for animated primetime comedy was The Simpsons, which had expanded the form's possibilities but within certain limits of content and tone. Family Guy's willingness to be more aggressively adult, to go to places The Simpsons would not go, helped establish that animated comedy could occupy a wider spectrum of tone and content than had previously been assumed. This was a genuine expansion of the form's possibilities, one that subsequent animated shows built on. The show's relationship to the Parents Television Council and the FCC generated a public debate about broadcast standards and the appropriate limits of television content that had consequences beyond Family Guy specifically. The extensive legal and regulatory processes around the show's content helped clarify, through the FCC's consistent decline to sanction the show, exactly where the legal lines of broadcast indecency were drawn. This clarity had implications for other shows operating near those lines, establishing precedents that protected content that might otherwise have been more vulnerable. The Cartoon Wars controversy generated the most intellectually substantive public debate about comedy writing that animated television has produced in the past 20 years. Parker and Stone's argument about the relationship between comedy and storytelling, their specific critique of the cutaway format's relationship to character and narrative, was serious enough to generate extensive critical responses that engaged with the question on its merits rather than simply taking sides between the two shows. The debate that Cartoon Wars prompted about what comedy owes to its audience, about what it means for a joke to be integrated into a story versus simply placed beside one, is a genuinely interesting aesthetic debate that the episode made accessible to a wide popular audience. The Brian Griffin death situation generated public discussion about the relationship between fictional characters and audience emotional investment that touched on genuine questions about how narrative fiction works and what obligations it has to the people who invest in it. The speed of Brian's resurrection made those questions particularly pointed, because it forced a confrontation with the question of whether the emotional investment had been legitimate or had been engineered specifically to be exploited. The Megabuse controversy generated discussion about what comedy owes to its recurring targets, about the difference between using a character as a comic target and using a character as nothing but a comic target, and about what message a show sends through the accumulated patterns of its storytelling over hundreds of episodes. These are not trivial questions, and Family Guy's specific handling of Meg provided a concrete and extensively documented case study for thinking through them. The voice actor controversy in 2020 contributed to industry-wide conversations about casting practices in animation, conversations that resulted in real changes across multiple shows. Mike Henry's voluntary decision to step down from the Cleveland Brown role and the subsequent casting of Arif Zahir was not simply a Family Guy story. It was part of a broader reckoning with representation in animated voiceover that affected The Simpsons, Central Park, Big Mouth, and numerous other shows simultaneously. All of these contributions to broader cultural conversations are real parts of the show's legacy, real effects of its existence on the world beyond the specific episodes themselves. They are not sufficient to redeem the show's worst moments or to paper over its real creative failures. But they are part of what the show was and what it did, and a complete accounting of Family Guy has to acknowledge them alongside the scandals and the decline and the controversies. Family Guy mattered. It mattered for specific and describable reasons at specific moments in its history, and its mattering had real effects on American entertainment and American cultural conversation. That is worth acknowledging clearly, even in the middle of an honest reckoning with everything that went wrong. Thank you for spending this time with this story. If you made it all the way to the end of this marathon, leave a comment below with the word marathon so we know who the true dedicated viewers are. Drop your location and the time too. Sleep well wherever you are tonight, and subscribe if you want more. Deep Dive: the episodes that still hold up and why. It is worth spending some time on the specific episodes from across the show's run that represent its best work, not simply as a sentimental exercise, but because understanding what they got right illuminates what went wrong in the episodes around them and helps explain why the show's reputation remains complicated rather than simply negative. The road trip episodes featuring Brian and Stewie together are the most consistently praised subset of the show's catalog, and they are worth examining as a group. Road to Rhode Island, Road to Europe, Road to Rupert, Road to the Multiverse, and the others in this informal series each benefited from the same structural advantage. By removing Brian and Stewie from the Griffin household and placing them in unfamiliar territory together, the episodes created a context where the two characters had to rely on each other in ways that revealed their genuine affection. The comedy came from the friction between their different temperaments applied to genuine challenges rather than from the show's default mode of joke delivery without emotional stakes. What made these episodes work was precisely what the show failed to do in its average episode. They had actual narratives with actual stakes. Stewie needed to get somewhere or find something. Brian needed to help him. Their friendship was tested and demonstrated through the specific content of the story rather than simply asserted through dialogue. The cutaways that appeared in these episodes felt motivated by the story rather than inserted into spaces between plot beats. And both characters behaved consistently with who they were supposed to be, which made the moments of genuine connection between them feel earned. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie stands as perhaps the single best episode of the post-revival era. It has no cutaways. It is just two characters in a bank vault talking. It was a risk for a show whose identity was built on non-stop visual comedy, and it paid off in ways that the show rarely managed before or after. The episode revealed Brian's suicidal ideation, Stewie's genuine love for Brian, the depth of what both characters carried beneath their comedic exteriors. It was not trying to be funny in the show's usual sense. It was trying to be honest about who these characters were, and the honesty produced something affecting in a way that the show's regular approach rarely achieved. The Simpsons crossover episode The Simpsons Guy from Season 13 had its flaws, including the rape joke in the trailer that generated significant controversy before the episode even aired. But it also produced some genuinely clever comedy around the comparison between the two families. Moments where the differences in how both shows handle similar character types were made explicit in ways that were funny and illuminating. The treatment of Meg in that episode, her connection with Lisa and her discovery of the saxophone, was the best the character had been written in years. The episode demonstrated that when the show was trying to do something specific and approached it with genuine craft, it could still produce work of real quality. Individual moments and individual cutaways from across the show's run continue to circulate widely on the internet precisely because they represent genuinely clever and well-constructed comedy. The specific gag about Peter injuring his knee that goes on for an uncomfortable length of time works as a piece of anti-humor in ways that the show did not always manage to make anti-humor work. Certain Conway Twitty sequences found genuine comedy in the replacement of comedy with a country music performance, the absurdism of the choice functioning as its own kind of joke about commitment to a bit. The show's musical numbers, across different seasons, maintained a quality that reflected MacFarlane's genuine love of and competence in that form. Seth MacFarlane's voice work remained consistently strong even when the material he was performing was below his capabilities, and the vocal performances gave certain scenes a quality that elevated the writing around them. The Peter and Lois relationship, while significantly deteriorated from its early season warmth, still occasionally produced episodes that found something genuine in how two specific people navigate a long marriage. The moments where the show remembered that Peter genuinely loved Lois, even in later seasons, landed differently from the surrounding material because they connected back to something that had been established as real during the show's best years. These remnants of quality are what keep the show's critical reputation from being simply negative. A show that had no genuine achievements would be easier to dismiss. A show that clearly had genuine achievements and then failed to sustain them, that produced work of real quality alongside work of considerably less quality, is a more complicated thing to assess. Family Guy is that more complicated thing, and the complications are part of its story. Deep dive. What the final seasons need to do. The 4-season renewal through 2028 gives Family Guy the opportunity to do something it has rarely attempted in its later years, to end with intention rather than simply to continue until cancellation or executive decision makes it stop. Whether that opportunity will be seized is unknowable from this vantage point. But what an intentional final chapter would need to accomplish is worth thinking about. First, it would need to give the characters genuine resolutions. Peter Griffin becoming a lovable fool again, even briefly, before the show ends would be a form of acknowledgement of what was lost. Brian Griffin being given a storyline that honored who he was in the original seasons, rather than who he became, would be a form of repair. Meg Griffin getting an arc that allowed her to leave the show as a person rather than a punching bag would feel like justice, however belatedly delivered. Second, it would need to find a way to make the cutaway format mean something again, to use it with intention rather than habit. Not necessarily to use fewer cutaways, though that might help, but to use them in ways that feel connected to the stories they appear in, rather than interchangeable with any other cutaway that could have been inserted in the same slot. Third, it would need some honest engagement with what the show was and what it became. Family Guy's meta-awareness of its own decline has mostly taken the form of self-deprecating jokes that acknowledge the problem without addressing it. An actual engagement with that arc, in whatever form the show found appropriate, would be something genuinely new. None of this is guaranteed or even particularly likely. The economic logic that has sustained the show through its post-peak years does not require the final seasons to be especially good. It requires them to generate sufficient content to maintain the franchise's active status and to add episodes to the library. These are achievable goals regardless of whether the show makes any meaningful creative effort in its remaining seasons. But the possibility remains. Family Guy at its best demonstrated that it could produce work of genuine quality and genuine originality. The writing room still contains people who know how to write well. The voice cast has not diminished. The franchise has more than enough creative capital to draw on, if anyone chooses to draw on it. Whether anyone will is the question that the remaining seasons will answer. The show that started in a man's kitchen in the late 1990s, drawn by someone who had not slept properly in months because he had something he urgently needed to say, still has the option to say something worth hearing in its final chapter. That option exists. What happens with it is the final scandal, or the final redemption, still waiting to be written. Sleep well, wherever you are tonight. The Griffin family will probably still be around next week. A final note before you sleep. There is something fitting about the fact that Family Guy, a show that has generated more controversy than almost any other in the history of American animation, that has been canceled and resurrected and sued and complained about and satirized by its competitors and publicly disowned by its creator and renewed through the sheer force of commercial momentum, is still here. Still airing, still being watched, still generating the occasional moment that reminds you why people fell in love with it in the first place. The show is a testament to the weird and specific way that American entertainment works, where quality and longevity are not the same thing, where commercial viability can outlast creative vitality by decades, where a man who spent 6 months without sleep drawing in his kitchen because he had something urgent to say, can eventually find himself continuing his creation primarily because the spreadsheet says it should continue and the audience has not quite stopped watching yet. None of that diminishes the best of what Family Guy was. The original seasons are real and they are still there. The characters that MacFarlane built in those first 3 years, the relationships between them, the specific and original comic sensibility that animated them at their best, those things existed. They changed the landscape of American comedy in ways that are still felt. They made millions of people laugh in ways that people still reference and share and celebrate. The scandals are also real, all of them, from the scheduling disasters that nearly killed the show before it found its voice, to the creative decisions that diluted that voice once it had been found. The story of Family Guy is the story of how something great can gradually become less great through accumulated choices and institutional pressures, and the passage of time and the weight of commercial obligations. It is a story that plays out with variations in creative endeavors across every medium and every era. Family Guy just played it out more visibly and more loudly than most. If you are listening to this at the end of a long day, in the quiet before sleep, know that whatever the show eventually became, it started as something one person needed to make. That specific kind of creative necessity produced something worth remembering. The rest of the story is what happened after, and that is always the harder part to tell. Sleep well. Thank you for being here. What makes Family Guy's story worth telling in full is precisely that it is not a simple story. It is not the story of a good show that got bad, or a bad show that somehow stayed on the air, or a creator who sold out, or a network that ruined something good. It is all of those things simultaneously, braided together across more than 2 decades of television, producing a record of what it looks like when genuine talent meets institutional pressure and commercial logic in the specific environment of American primetime entertainment at the turn of the 21st century. The record is complicated. The record is real. And the record is worth examining carefully, because Family Guy is one of the most thoroughly documented examples in the history of American entertainment of how creative things change over time, for better and for worse, and what forces drive those changes in directions that the original creators may not have intended and might not have chosen. Thank you for spending this time with that record. It has been a genuine pleasure to tell this story. Good night. Sleep well, everyone. Until next time,